Welcome back, brothers and heretics, to Grimhammer. Before we get into the Iron Warriors madness, be sure to like and comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor or the Dark Gods. And I thank you guys for support. I've been absolutely killing it. Now, let's get into the video.
The first shells struck before dawn and made the wall of hive Helicon shudder like an old man taking a blade between the ribs. I woke with my teeth clamped hard enough to draw blood from my own tongue. Dust cascaded from the trench gallery roof in choking curtains. The plasteel ribs above us screamed. Somewhere down the line, men shouted in the dark. And then the second impact came, harder than the first. A deep-bellied concussion that rolled through the underworks beneath the curtain wall and kicked every bunk frame, ammo crate, prayer niche, and field stove sideways. For one mad heartbeat, I thought the hive itself had finally given way. Hive Helicon had always felt eternal to those born beneath its shadow. Its walls were mountain thick, layered with ceramite facing and ferrocrete cores older than most sectors, patched and repatched across centuries of siege doctrine and tithing labor. Men said the first stones had been laid when the world was young and the Emperor's Great Crusade still cast a living light across the stars. Men said a great many things in the dark. None of those sayings mattered when a shell from an enemy gun hit home with the force of a small god's fist. The alarm klaxons began half a second later, braying through the galleries beneath the wall in great metallic howls that set every nerve on edge. I rolled from my cot into grit and cold mud, caught my laser gun before it slid under the bunk frame, and slammed my shoulder into Corporal Jorek Bale's boots as he was trying to stand. "Up," he snarled, not because I was slow, but because that was how he spoke when fear got its hooks into him. "On your feet, Voss. Emperor's wounds up. I am up." Another shell landed. Somewhere above us, masonry cracked with a sound like giant bones breaking in a beast too large to die cleanly. That was how the siege of Helicon began for me. Not with a bugle, not with a speech, not with banners on the walls and courage in the chest. It began in dark air that tasted of damp earth, machine oil and old sweat, with my ears ringing and my heart beating so hard I thought the men around me must hear it. I am Sergeant Lucan Voss of the 19th Varden Sappers, or I was then, before rank and duty and memory all began to rot together. I had been born in the sumphabs beneath the Western Manufactoria, where boys learn to count by tallying shells and dead men alike. I had never seen an open sky until the guard took me. And by the throne, I sometimes think that was a mercy, because a sky teaches a man to hope there is something beyond the walls. On Caldrex Tertius, walls were everything. We had fortress hives for cities, trench belts for frontiers, and faith for mortar. Caldrex Tertius was dying before the Iron Warriors ever put boots on its soil. Billions lived on that world. Billions laboured in the furnace hives, the ore bastions, the refinery cathedra, and the gun foundries where the air itself tasted metallic and men coughed, black before middle age. When the first reports came of traitor fleets breaching the outer void pickets, the roadways between the hives clogged with refugees in numbers so vast that traffic cogitators burned out trying to count them. Convoy after convoy rolled in from the fallen continents. Conscripts, pressed labour battalions, administratum clerks with their hands still ink-stained, manufactorum drudges carrying children and icon slates, farm levies from the ash plains who had never held anything deadlier than a cutting saw until a quartermaster shoved a laser gun into their hands and pointed them toward a wall. By the time the noose tightened around Helicon, the hive was already choking on its own population. Every transit artery was jammed. Every lower hab was packed beyond ration capacity. Men slept in shifts on stairwells, in loading bays, beneath shrine altars, and in shell lifts that no longer moved. The priests called it a congregation of the faithful. The quartermasters called it a nightmare of arithmetic. The truth was simpler. It was too much flesh in too little stone, waiting for war to choose where to bite. I slapped a fresh charge pack into my laser gun and looked around our gallery as the lumen strips flickered red. Jorek Bale was already hauling on his flak coat. He was a broad slab of a man from the quarry clans, shoulders like bunker doors, bald scalp crisscrossed by old weld burns from his youth in demolition pits. He feared nothing so long as he could put his hands on it. Things he could not punch, strangle, bayonet, or carry made him foul-tempered. Serev Kul, our Voxman, was crouched over his set, with his mouth hanging open, as though he might catch clear orders by breathing them in. He had the gaunt look of a Skolem dropout, and fingers that never stopped moving, always tapping, adjusting, fretting. He trusted signals more than men, which was a flaw in a siege because signals die quicker. Malrech Dor, our best shot, was already awake and already calm, seated on his bunk as he checked the action of his long last with ritual care. Malrech had one eye milky from a plasma flare and another sharp enough to read movement through smoke at 1/2 kilometer. He spoke rarely and smiled never. I trusted him more for both. Ven Tor was muttering the canticle of readiness while wrapping his rebreather seals around his neck, each line spoken with the speed of someone bargaining against panic. He was hive-born like me, thin as wire and quick with entrenching tools. He had buried 2 brothers during the uprisings in the lower sectors and had not forgiven the galaxy since. Old Heston Row, attached to us from the Engineer Corps, stood in the chamber doorway with mechadendrites twitching in irritation, as if the shelling offended him on a liturgical level. He was not old by Mechanicus standards, perhaps, but old enough for half his face to be brass and both lungs to hiss when he breathed. He believed every structural failure was a moral failure, first. Above us, the wall shook again. The Vox set spat a burst of static. Then a clipped command channel broke through. All sapper sections to readiness positions. Repeat. All sapper sections to readiness positions. Enemy long-range bombardment has commenced. Outer continents declared lost. Naval engagement remains contested. All hands stand to, by order of Hive Command. Contested. That was a beautiful word for a losing void war. Serev turned to me, face pale beneath grime. They're saying the outer continents are gone. They were gone yesterday, Jorek said. They never said it plain. They have now. Another voice cut across the channel, colder, more senior, stripped of every softness human speech can possess. Enemy drop strength exceeds initial projections. Auspex Clark stations on levels 30 through 40 are to discontinue individual landing tallies and revert to mass threat indexing. There are too many contacts for precision count. No man spoke after that. He did not need to tell us what it meant. If the Clarks had stopped counting, then the numbers had moved beyond warfare and into weather, beyond tactical and into elemental. Somewhere beyond the hive walls, the enemy was landing in such quantity that arithmetic itself had been judged a waste of effort. We climbed the access ladders beneath the curtain wall, with our gear knocking against our backs and prayer strips fluttering in the concussive wind. Men streamed through the stairwells around us, hundreds of them, boots splashing in runoff, curses and litanies mingling in the dim red light. I remember the smell more than anything. Wet stone, machine grease, burnt insulation, fear, sweat. The odor of too many bodies trapped in a place built to outlast reason. At the upper firing gallery, we joined Lieutenant Garin Vey and the remnants of 2nd Trench Command. Vey was young for the bars on his collar, too handsome for war. With a saber scar across his jaw, he wore like an argument settled in his favor. He gripped a data slate in one gloved hand and looked as if he had not slept in 3 days. Sergeant Voss, he said when he saw me, your section holds the western repair culvert and wall access to Bastion Subline 7. If the parapet breaches, you seal and reinforce. If the parapet collapses, you pull back in order and prepare demolition. Do not let panic move faster than orders. As commanded, Lieutenant. He nodded once and turned away, before either of us had to pretend that orders would matter once the wall truly opened. Commissar Holt-Skane met us on the parapet. He looked carved rather than born, tall, raw-boned, black greatcoat snapping in the cold pre-dawn wind, cap brim low over eyes so pale they seemed cut from winter glass. A bolt pistol hung in one fist like an extension of judgment itself. The men quieted as he walked the line. Even the shells seemed to leave room for his voice when he finally spoke. "Hear me." That was all. 2 words, and every man did. "The world behind us is the Emperor's. The walls beneath your boots are the Emperor's. The flesh in your bones and the breath in your lungs are on loan from the Emperor of mankind. You speak of fear as if it were an excuse. It is not. Fear is a tax levied on the weak. You will pay it in silence and continue your duty. You will not ask if relief is coming. You will not ask how many enemies stand beyond the wire. You will not ask if other hives still hold. Such questions belong to men with the luxury to doubt. You have no such luxury." He let the next shell strike land before he went on. The wall bucked. Nobody moved. If the enemy comes to the parapet, you kill him. If the enemy kills the man beside you, you step into his place and kill in his stead. If I hear one word of retreat, cowardice, or despair, I will put a bolt round through the skull of the speaker and save the traitors the ammunition. Duty is all that. Remains when victory is uncertain. You will do your duty. There was no applause, no cheer. In the guard, a commissar who needed cheering had already failed. Confessor Malrech followed him a few minutes later and turned cold iron into fire. Malrech had once been a hive-ganger if the scars were truthful, and I think they were. Time and faith had hammered him into something harder than piety alone could make. His face was a ruin of old knife work and candle burns. His skull was shaved and branded with the aquila. He walked the parapet, in a patched red stole darkened by old blood and machine ash, carrying a staff topped with a brass icon of the throne. "Do not pray for survival," he barked. "Survival is for vermin under floor plates. Pray for witness. Pray that when the God Emperor looks upon this wall, he sees sons worthy of his gaze. This is not a test of whether you live. It is a test of what in you deserves to live forever." Men straightened at that. Some from faith, some from shame. Often there is no difference. Dawn came grudgingly, a grey bruise spreading across the horizon behind the smoke banks. When the shelling paused, the silence it left behind felt diseased. That was when I first saw them. I took Malrech's magnoculars and looked beyond the wire fields and crater belts, out across the corpse-flat land before Hive Helicon. At first, all I saw was mud, fog, and the long black geometry of trenchworks that had not been there 3 days earlier. Then my sight settled, and the pattern revealed itself. The Iron Warriors had made the earth into a theorem. Their siege lines spread from horizon to horizon in layered exactitude. Primary trenches cut in dead straight angles. Secondary berms raised to channel return fire into sacrificial ground. Gun pits nested behind overlapping revetments. Wire lattices set not merely to slow an advance, but to herd it into mathematically optimal kill lanes. Range stakes, auger masts, ammunition roads stamped flat by tracked haulers. Everything aligned, everything measured, nothing wasted. It did not look like a camp. It looked like a machine too large to fit inside the world, using the world's skin as its outer casing. And among that vastness stood the warriors themselves. Gunmetal giants, hazard-striped pauldrons caked in ash and mud, helms like fortress visors, motionless beside batteries the size of hab blocks, while columns of slaves dragged shells through the mire on chains and harnesses. They did not posture. They did not roar challenges. They stood as if they had already calculated our deaths and were merely waiting for the equation to finish. Malrech took the magnoculars from me and hissed through his teeth. "Throne," Jorek said. "Astartes?" "Traitors," I answered. No word for them is ever large enough. Then the first true bombardment began. The horizon flashed. Not in one place, but everywhere, a line of fire stretching across the world. A half-second later, the sound hit us. Not one report, but a continent of impacts layered over each other until the air itself became a solid thing. Shells screamed over our heads. The hab districts behind the wall vanished under rising blossoms of black earth and orange fire. Tower blocks folded. Transit lines buckled. A shell struck a refugee column somewhere below, and a red spray blew high enough to paint the side of the wall. More shells came, earth shakers, siege mortars, macro cannon rounds, big as shrine columns. The city convulsed under them. Through the firing slit, I watched an entire hab stack in the lower district take a direct hit and dissolve into a cloud of masonry, metal, and human fragments. The shockwave raced through the transit tunnels beneath us a moment later, vomiting body parts and broken stone out through maintenance grills in wet heaps. A severed hand slapped against the parapet, not 3 meters from where Ven was kneeling. It still wore a child's ration band around the wrist. Men began, firing into the smoke, though there was nothing yet to shoot. The Vox erupted with screaming channels, medical pleas, fire reports, requests for counter-battery data. A colonel somewhere was shouting for reserves that did not exist. Beneath it all came a new signal, cutting through every frequency with machine-bred authority. The voice that spoke was transhuman and toneless, more engine than man. Defenders of Hive Helicon, resistance is a delay, not a variable. Static swallowed the channel. Nobody said anything for several seconds. Even Skarni had no rebuke ready for that. I looked again through the magnocular slit at the lines beyond the walls, at the guns, the slaves, the towering silhouettes waiting among the batteries, and I understood something that no briefing slate had conveyed, and no sermon had prepared me to feel. This was not a raid, not an invasion, not one more battle in a war already too large for any man to comprehend. This was an Iron Warriors siege. That meant they had not come only to kill us. Killing is simple. Killing is mercy by the standards of the 41st millennium. They had come to measure every wall, break every habit, poison every hour, and turn time itself into a weapon. They would crush sleep before they crushed stone. They would crush hope before they crushed flesh. They would teach the hive the shape of despair with mathematics, artillery, and patience older than our world's memory. The shelling went on. The dawn never really arrived. By second dusk, the order came for us to leave the comparative mercy of the curtain galleries and reinforce Bastion Karin. Mercy is a false word in a siege. It suggests gradations of suffering, as if one part of a dying fortress is truly kinder than another. The wall galleries of Helicon had become ovens of dust, noise, and fear, but Karin was worse by reputation alone. It sat beyond the main western curtain line, a crownwork of layered guns, trenches, and concrete fighting tiers, thrust out into the ash plain like a clenched fist. It had been built to kill the first enemy who dared approach the hive. By the time Lieutenant Vey read our assignment slate in the lumen gloom, Karin had instead become the first place chosen for sacrifice. We marched out through a transit breach beneath the wall under a sky the color of bruised iron. The roads behind the western hive face were choked with the whole anatomy of defeat. Regiments in full redeployment tramped across the raised causeways with banners blackened by soot and unit marks painted over fresh patches where old honors had been burned away by fire or shame. I saw armored columns grinding east with barrels elevated and track guards slick with mud and blood. I saw lines of indentured laborers dragging ammunition sledges while overseers lashed them onward with electrocords. I saw refugees pressed against barricades in such density that they no longer moved like people at all, only as a trembling mass of rags, hands and staring eyes. Men carried bundles that had once been children. Children carried ration tins larger than their own heads. Preachers bellowed from wrecked chimera hulls. Medici carts rolled past, so laden with amputees that arms and legs jostled loose and slapped wetly against the wheels. Above it all, far across the polluted horizon, one of the lesser hive spires burned. At first I thought it was only another manufactorum plume. Then something luminous broke through the cloud deck and came screaming down from the upper atmosphere, trailing fire long enough to touch the stars. It struck beyond the northern districts with a white flash that drowned the whole skyline for a heartbeat. A minute later, the concussion reached us, heavy enough to rattle the bolts of nearby bunkers. Men on the roadway stopped and turned. Even the refugees found silence. "Orbital kill," Serev muttered, clutching his Vox cradle tighter. "Void war's going bad." "It was bad yesterday," Jorek said. "It is worse today." Jorek spat black phlegm into the roadway and adjusted the breaching maul slung over his back. "Tomorrow it will be glorious then. Nice of the traitors to keep things varied." That was Bale. He joked the way wounded men bite leather. Every word sounded half a sneer, half a confession that he was afraid and hated himself for it. His voice steadied the squad anyway. Men will follow a bitter fool before they follow a trembling saint. Brack lumbered beside us with a demolition crate chained to one slab-like wrist. The Ogren's rebreather mask was painted with a crude aquila, and his flak apron had been patched so many times that no two plates matched in colour. He kept glancing up at the burning sky with open delight. "Big boom," he said. "Yes," I told him. "Big boom." He grinned beneath the mask. "Good war." Nobody answered that. The approach to Bastion Karin ran through zigzag communication trenches cut into the blasted earth. They were already crowded with moving units, and bodies carried the other way. By then, the enemy guns had the range. Every few minutes, a shell would howl overhead and tear open some stretch of trench line ahead or behind us, flinging men and mud and broken plasteel boards high into the smoke. We climbed over a dead heavy weapons team that had been packed into the clay like meat hammered into a dish. Only the barrel of their autocannon still jutted from the earth, hot enough to hiss in the rain. When Karin finally loomed out of the haze, it looked less like a fortification than a section of the world peeled open to show the bones beneath. Tier upon tier of firing steps, gun pits, recessed bunkers, magazine tunnels and machine nests rose from the ground in brutal angular geometry. The crownwork guns on its upper platforms were still firing, but not at any rhythm a sane man would call sustained. They barked in frantic, irregular sequences, each muzzle flash a prayer that lasted less than a second before the answer came back from the enemy. The Iron Warriors' counter-battery fire began as soon as our own guns spoke. I had heard officers praise the precision of traitor Astartes before. They always spoke in terms of discipline and long memory, as if ancient warfare were the same thing as divine competence. Seeing it from Karin cured me of such simplifications. It was not merely that the enemy answered quickly, it was that each response landed where it would do the greatest structural and spiritual harm. A Hydra platform 2 terraces above us belched fire toward the western plain. Less than a minute later, 3 enemy rounds struck in an exact walking pattern across the emplacement. The first smashed the ammunition lift. The second collapsed the crew shelter. The third burst directly atop the weapon mount just as reserve loaders emerged from the access ladder below. Men came apart in a red mist among tumbling shell casings and burning hydraulic fluid. "Emperor preserve us," Ven whispered. The next counter-battery strike punched through a command bunker cupola on the east face. There was no dramatic explosion, only a flat flash and a gout of black pressure that blew maps, limbs and Vox components clear across the Bastion crest. Lieutenant Vey had barely finished passing our attachment orders to the local command staff before the bunker went up. By the time we reached cover, all that remained of the Bastion adjutant was a smoking lower torso still seated at the plotter table. "They're watching for muzzle flare," Malrech said in that dry, dead way of his. "The moment we speak, they answer." "Then we stop speaking," Jorek growled. Karin's commander, a colonel with one arm in a sling and his lips split raw from constant shouting, sent us to reinforce the western mortar trenches. We spent the next hours hauling crates, relaying power feeds, resighting sandbags that no longer resembled bags so much as wet, blood-dark loaves. Around us, the wider war moved like some vast industrial process. Entire line companies crossed the rear causeways toward other bastions. Fuel tankers burned where orbital debris had punched through them. Servitor chains dragged new gun shields into place over the dead. Far back toward Helicon proper, sirens screamed from the Hab districts without pause. Serev fought his Vox set the entire time. The enemy had begun flooding the bands with machine-scrambled interference, slurred Binharic contamination, false command bursts and looping distress calls copied from our own dead. More than once, one of our boys turned toward a side trench because he thought he heard his squad leader calling for aid, only for Serev to seize his sleeve and curse him back into place. "It's mimic work," he snapped. "Signal ghosts. Do not answer unknown call signs. Do not answer any voice you cannot place." Jorek laughed without humor as he rammed a fresh shell into a mortar. Cradle. "Good. Soon enough we can distrust our own ears as well as our officers." "Shut your mouth and lift," I said. He grinned at me with split lips. "There he is, our noble sergeant. Tell me, Voss, when this wall goes up, do you reckon I'll finally be promoted for enthusiasm? When this wall goes up, you'll be promoted to corpse. That has advancement in it." The mortar crews around us laughed too hard at that. Men always do when death is near. Laughter becomes less a sign of mirth than a leak in the mind where terror escapes in noise. By full dark, the order came down from what remained of command. A siege mortar bank beyond the west killzone had been ranging Karin with murderous accuracy for hours. Counterfire had failed to silence it. Air support no longer existed. The Bastion was to launch a trench raid under cover of smoke, cut through the wire, plant melter charges in the gun pits, and withdraw before the enemy could mass response elements. Desperate orders are the purest coin of a siege. They arrive wrapped in necessity and spend men faster than shells. Lieutenant Vey gathered the assault sections in a recessed magazine chamber lit by guttering lumen globes. Our force amounted to sappers, line infantry remnants, 2 flamer teams, Brack, and a handful of volunteers who had that hollow-eyed look, meaning they were too tired to remember fear. Malrech passed among us with a censer clanking from his fist, painting our foreheads with machine ash and sacred oil. "You go into the mouth of iron," he said to each man. "Make the enemy choke." Skane was there too, silent in the chamber mouth, bolt pistol across his chest. He said nothing until the briefing was done. "Any man who returns without obeying the order to place his charge," he said, "will answer to me before dawn." He did not need to say what form that answer would take. We went over the top beneath a sky hidden by smoke and artillery flare. The ground between Karin and the enemy lines had ceased to be land. It was a churned waste of shell hollows, tattered wire, flooded craters and body parts too trampled to assign to anyone dead. We moved in staggered rushes, crouched low, smoke canisters hissing around us while the guns behind and ahead traded thunder over our skulls. Mud sucked at our boots. Somewhere to my right, a man screamed for his mother until a shell fragment cut the cry short. We reached the first enemy wire, and Ven went to work with cutters while Jorek held his breacher shield over both of them. Autogun fire stitched through the smoke from somewhere unseen. Sparks flew from the shield rim. Jorek laughed once, harsh and breathless. "See," he muttered. "I told you this would be a memorable evening." We got through. The gun pits rose out of the murk all at once, huge earthen mouths lined in revetment plates and corrugated steel. I expected traitor artillerymen in patchwork flak, perhaps overseen by the occasional iron warrior. What I saw instead stalled me for half a second with cold revulsion. The mortars were manned by flayed men, not skinned cleanly, as in a Medica theatre or corpse yard harvest, but raggedly peeled. Their muscles shone wet in the muzzle flashes. Cables and chains ran from their wrists, spines and jaw hinges to firing levers, traverse wheels and loading tracks. Some still had eyelids, some did not. Their mouths worked soundlessly beneath muzzles that had been nailed or wired open. Overseer serfs in iron masks drove them with shock prods and hooked staffs. Every time a shell was rammed home, one of the skinless things convulsed against his restraints, and another round rose from the lift. For a moment, none of us fired. Then Brack roared and charged. The Ogren crashed into the nearest pit like a dropped slab of masonry, ripping one overseer apart with his bare hands and beating another to death against the mortar carriage. The spell broke. Lasfire slashed the dark. Flamer teams washed the revetments in liquid fire, I dropped into the first pit with Jorek and Ven behind me, landed ankle deep in blood water and drag grease, and shot a chain gang handler through the throat. A flayed loader reached for me with fingers worn to bone. I put him down too because there was no mercy left to give. "Charges!" I shouted. "Now!" Jorek slammed the first melter pack against the mortar base and thumbed it live. Ven placed another beneath the ammo lift. Around us, the raid dissolved into close slaughter. Men hacked at chains. Men shot blinded slaves that lurched toward them aflame. One of our flamers burst under return fire and turned its bearer into a running torch. That was when I saw my first Iron Warrior at arm's reach. He emerged through the shell smoke on the far lip of the pit, towering over his mortal auxilia like a fortress idol come alive. Gunmetal plate, hazard bands across one pauldron, battle scarring like old tool marks cut into. His armor, his helm lenses burned a dead mechanical red. He carried no banner, no trophy rack, no spiked nonsense. Only a bolt gun and a servo-assisted measuring staff folded along his backpack like some obscene surveyor's instrument. He looked down into the pit where we were killing his slaves and said, in a voice cold enough to frost the soul, "Traverse 3 degrees. Cut the left approach. Expenditure priority to breacher concentrations. Do not waste shells on scattered fugitives." That was all. Not rage, not challenge. A work order. He raised the bolt gun and fired. 2 men behind me disappeared in wet bursts. The Iron Warrior kept advancing with the same steady tread, firing between clipped corrections to his subordinates. "Angle low, range hold, autocannon nests, mark smoke edge, mines active on my command." Jorek bellowed and rushed him with the breacher maul, half from courage and half from the blind hatred that grips ordinary men when they finally stand before the transhuman thing, murdering them. The Iron Warrior shot him once in the chest. Jorek spun, slammed against the revetment and somehow stayed upright, armor broken, blood pumping through his coat. I threw the last melter charge and dragged Jorek down as the pit filled with return fire. The enemy had let us in. Autocannon nests hidden beyond the mortar banks opened in disciplined convergence, not on the pits, but on the withdrawal lanes behind us. Men trying to pull back through the smoke were cut apart in rows. The minefields beyond the breached wire woke next, blossoms of dirt and red ruin stepping across the dark, where our assault force had come through minutes before. Whoever had planned the defense had known exactly how far panic would carry a man, and exactly where his boots would land. "Back!" I shouted. "Back now!" No order in war sounds less believable than retreat. We climbed out through a storm of metal and screaming. Malrech fell somewhere to my right and rose, again with half his face opened, still firing. Then vanished in a mine burst that left only his entrenching tools spinning end over end in the air. Serev stumbled beside me, clutching his Vox unit with one hand and his intestines with the other man's blood all over his sleeves. Jorek lurched on, somehow moving with the stubborn, furious momentum of men too angry to accept they are dying. Brack saved us. He came back through the smoke carrying 2 wounded guardsmen, one slung under each massive arm like broken dolls, laughing in that deep, childlike way of his as rounds sparked from his armor plates. "Got them," he boomed. "Got little men." One of the men he carried had no lower jaw. The other was trying to hold his own lungs inside his chest with both hands. Brack laughed because he was happy he had rescued them. There was no irony in him, no calculation, only joy at doing what he believed good. It made the sight unbearable in a way mere gore never could. We hit the wire, under autocannon fire. Jorek used his own body as cover, while I cut a gap wide enough for Brack to force through. A shell landed close enough to throw us all flat. When I clawed back to my knees, I saw the first mortar pit erupt behind us. The melter pack boiling armor plate and carriage steel into white ruin. Then the second went. Then the third. For one glorious, hateful instant, I thought we had done it. Then the enemy guns farther back opened in answer, and the whole raid corridor became a furnace. Somehow, by spite or providence, a fraction of us made it back to Bastion Karin. What remained of the assault force collapsed into the trench galleries while medici teams dragged away the savable and priests anointed the unsalvageable. Jorek was laid on an ammo crate while a chirurgeon stapled his chest wound shut without anesthetic. He kept cursing the whole time, mostly because he had failed to kill the Iron Warrior with his own hands. "You saw him," Serev whispered to me. Later, after the morphia screams had begun, "I saw him. What was he like?" I thought of the measured voice, the utter absence of fury in it, the way he had issued murder as if balancing a ledger. "Busy," I said. That was the truth of them. Not mad, not glorious, not noble in ruin. Busy. Near dawn, the bombardment paused again. That had become its own kind of omen. I climbed to an upper firing recess and looked out across the corpse plain through a cracked magnocular lens. The Iron Warriors were already at work. In the grey before sunrise, by the light of burning pits and distant hive fires, their recovery details moved through the blasted ground with machine calm. Mortal slave gangs hauled the dead into sorted rows. Wounded auxilia were tagged, triaged, or shot according to utility. Shattered gun shields were stripped for reusable plates. Damaged servitors were disassembled where they lay. Even fragments of broken war engines were winched onto flatbeds with a patience that felt more terrible than any berserk howl ever could have. They wasted nothing. Not flesh, not metal, not suffering. Everything had value if fed back into the siege. Behind me, Bastion Karin fired its remaining guns into the dark. Ahead of me, the enemy adjusted. The first incoming rounds landed less than a minute later. There was no ranging this time, no search pattern. They had the bastion's measure now down to the last cursed meter. Macro cannon fire struck the crownwork in planned sequence, collapsing outer parapets, detonating magazines and shattering support columns buried deep within the bastion's layered core. Earthshakers followed in hammering cadence. The ground heaved. Gun decks caved in atop trench lines. Men were buried standing. A manticore rack on the north shoulder exploded and turned a whole battery terrace into airborne shrapnel. "Karin is lost," Lieutenant Vey shouted over the Voxnet. "All surviving sections withdraw to secondary." The order cut off as the command post vanished in a column of black fire. We ran. Not from courage spent, but because stone itself had turned against us. The bastion was dying from the inside out. Bulkheads buckled. Access tunnels folded. Heat and dust blasted through the underlevels in suffocating waves. Brack shoved a fallen lintel aside with his shoulders so a knot of us could squeeze through. Jorek stumbled beside me, one hand pressed to his ruined chest, his breath bubbling red. Serev kept the Vox cradle clenched against his head, though it spat nothing now but static and fragments of screaming. We reached a rear trench line and threw ourselves into it, just as Bastion Karin ceased to exist as a coherent structure. The final barrage walked from tip to root with such murderous precision that it seemed less an act of bombardment than demolition. The outer tiers pancaked inward. Gun platforms tipped and vanished in smoke. The central redoubt split along old reinforcement seams and sank in on itself. What had taken generations of labour battalions to raise was reduced in minutes to a burning wound in the earth. No one spoke for a long time after. When morning came, the smoke thinned enough for the surviving lenses on the wall to see what the enemy had made of the defenders captured in the collapse. They hung from hooked construction cranes before the Iron Warriors' forward trenches, dozens of them turning slowly in the wind above the mud. Some were dead, some were not. Their uniforms flapped in tatters. Their boots dripped blood. One still wore the blue command sash of Karin's colonel. Another had been opened from groin to sternum so neatly that his ribs shone like wet ivory in the dawn. The guns began again, soon after sunrise. Nobody in Helicon asked any longer whether the enemy meant to take the hive. The question had become how much of us would remain by the time they were done measuring. Weeks ceased to feel like measures of time and became, instead, the names of bombardments. I remember the first week after Karin died because I still believed the siege had a shape I could understand. There had been the dawn shelling that woke the hive into terror, then the loss of the outer works, then the closing of the roads, then the wall routine. Repair, carry, bury, pray, eat. If there was food, sleep. If there was silence, wake to shellfire and begin again. I thought then that if I kept count, if I could mark each day on the inside of my head with enough discipline, I might remain a man and not sink into that muddy, gasping thing the siege wanted us all to become. By the third week, the count was gone. The hours broke apart beneath artillery. Morning was when the guns were less loud. Night was when the screams carried farther. Men slept in snatches with boots on and lasguns across their chests, waking unsure whether they had rested for minutes or an entire shift cycle. The dead stacked faster than burial details could move. Them. The wounded lingered longer because medici stores ran thin and amputations grew cruder. Every time a breach was patched, the enemy found another seam. Every time a trench was shored, some deeper line collapsed. The walls of Hive Helicon did not simply endure attack. They were interrogated. That was what Iron Warrior's warfare felt like from the inside. Not rage, not the frothing madness preached in Ministorum threat scrolls to make traitors seem lesser than us. Not even hatred in the simple form a guardsman understands, when another man aims a weapon at his face. Hatred has heat in it. This had none. It felt instead like being studied by something that already knew where you would fail, and only required enough pressure to make failure visible. A structural weakness, a fatigue fracture, a support beam burdened beyond tolerance. They did not descend upon the hive like beasts. They solved it. I began to understand that long before I saw their faces in the dark below the walls. Helicon sealed its inner gates in the 4th week. The order came from Hive Command after 3 separate breaches in the western transit districts and a wave of refugee panic that killed more people than the shelling in some sectors. Blast doors, the height of cathedrals, rolled shut with the finality of tomb lids. Internal mag rails ceased between whole districts. Cargo shafts were welded. Access routes were collapsed by deliberate charges. Millions who had hoped to flee deeper into the hive found themselves trapped in the wrong section when the gates sealed. Millions more found safety denied to them by geography, delay, or simple bad luck. The official proclamation called it compartmentalized defense. Every man in the trenches called it what it was. We had shut billions inside a furnace and told them to pray. The pressure of so much trapped flesh changed the hive. Ration lines became battles. Chapel halls became dormitories, full of fever breath and whispered blasphemy. Habstacks overflowed until men were sleeping in vent shafts and under conveyor belts, staking claim to square spans of floor with spent charge packs, torn blankets, and sharpened utensils. The water grew warm from overuse, and the metal tang never quite left it. At first we said that was old piping and stress corrosion. Later, nobody lied about it. The purification systems were failing in sections, and there was blood in the reclaim. Corpse details moved day and night. At the lower rendering stations, the dead were stripped, sorted, and fed into grinders under the supervision of adepts who no longer bothered to hide their incense burners behind modest screens. Flesh became paste. Bone became supplement. Whatever dogma once divided human remains from emergency ration stock had been crushed flat under necessity. Men ate because hunger overrides reverence. Priests blessed the vats. Quartermasters renamed the output as nutrient salvage. We all knew what it was. The smell of cooking starch in Helicon gained a sweetness that would have made any decent man retch if he had the strength left for disgust. Jorek chewed one such ration bar beside me in a repair alcove beneath the western curtain and said, "Tastes like Clark." "It tastes like chemical binder," I replied. He grinned with cracked lips, grey in the face from blood loss and poor healing. The chest wound he had taken at Karin had closed ugly and hot. He should have been in Medicae. There was no Medicae worth the name left for men who could still stand. "You always were an optimist, Voss." Across from us, Serev Kul sat with his back against a pipe trunk. trying to coax a damaged Vox unit into coherence with both hands blackened by copper dust and dried blood. He had lost weight until the bones at his jaw seemed to have sharpened. Static hissed from the speaker grill like an irritated serpent. Less talking, he muttered. More listening. To what? The tunnels. Jorek snorted. The tunnels are full of mud. Serev did not look up. Not anymore. By then, men were fighting over everything. A length of uncracked plastic sheeting was worth a beating in the right trench. Loose charge packs vanished if left unattended. Sleep niches were guarded like shrines. I saw 2 troopers from the line regiment stab one another over possession of a dry blanket. A prayer icon cut from stamped tin passed through 6 hands in one night because each man believed his own soul needed the Emperor's gaze more than the next. When ammunition came in, hands reached for the crates before the quartermasters could call unit marks. When no ammunition came in, the same hands reached for knives. The shelling never stopped while all this happened. That was the genius of it. The enemy did not allow us the dignity of collapse as a distinct event. They turned collapse into background texture. Men learned to argue over drinking water while dust shook from the roof. Priests learned to pronounce rites over the dying without pausing when the walls trembled. I learned to sleep with one hand over my laser gun and the other over my mouth so my teeth would not shatter against each other when the big guns hit. It was Enginseer Hestin Rowe who proved the enemy had begun working beneath us. He came to me in the lower revetment galleries with his robe hem black from sump runoff and one mechadendrite twitching so violently I knew some liturgical outrage had seized him. Heston did not frighten easily. He distrusted emotion on principle. If his remaining organic eye was wide, then something truly vile had been found. "Sergeant Voss," he said, his voice clicking through augmetic filters. "You will attend me now. I am on trench rotation. You are on whatever structural emergency I designate. Come." I followed him down 2 maintenance shafts and along a disused utility vein where the wall foundations met the old bedrock. The air grew hotter with every step, and a faint vibration passed through the soles of my boots, too deep and regular to be shelling. Heston halted by a cracked shrine alcove where a saint's face had long ago been worn smooth by the touch of workmen. He pressed a brass cone against the wall and handed me the listening rod. At first I heard nothing but the blood in my own ears. Then the sound resolved. Far below us, somewhere inside the roots of the hive, machinery was eating stone. Not mining. Not drilling in the way manufacturing crews drill. This was slower, heavier, with a wet mechanical pulse beneath it that made my teeth ache. A grinding bore, a thermal scream, a beat like an animal heart trapped inside steel. Heston's mechadendrite drove a probe into a seam and drew back a thread of grey dust. He held it beneath my nose. "Fresh vitrification," he said. "Rock fused by extreme heat. The enemy is tunneling, not with simple mole charges, with colossal thermodrills. There are warp signatures in the residue." I did not like the way the last words sat in the air. "Demon engines?" "Bound machine intelligences at minimum, possibly more profane syntheses. They are beneath the wall line already." I felt the vibration again. Once heard, it could not be unheard. It was in the bones of the hive, patient and obscene. Captain Oren Thass received the news in a command chamber that had once been a Magistratum records vault and now smelled of stale incense, map ink, and old fear. He was not a flamboyant officer, which was perhaps why I trusted him more quickly than Lieutenant Vey had. Thass was heavy-set, iron-haired, with a ruined nose and the habit of reading casualty slates as if they personally insulted him. He had the eyes of a man who had expected to die a dozen times and resented every postponement. When Heston finished his report, Thass looked at me and said, "Can your sappers collapse them?" "Depends how far advanced the works are." That was not the question. "Yes, Captain," I said. "We can try. Trying is for clerks." He leaned over the Tactica table, where crude auspex marks showed tremor lines spreading beneath the western districts. You will take Bale, Kuhl, Malrech, and whatever demolition burden you can carry. Hestin goes with you. Find the tunnels, break the support lattice, burn whatever hair-tech mechanism they are driving with. If they have reached the main foundation braces, you stop them. If they have not, you stop them sooner. And if the tunnels are larger than expected, Thas's expression did not move, then I expect larger courage. There are speeches that stir men and speeches that merely state the invoice. Thas belonged to the latter school. I saluted and left. We went below at shift dark. The access route opened from a maintenance crypt beneath the western industrial ward, through rusted hatches sealed since some previous age of civil unrest. The deeper we descended, the more the hive changed around us. Finished walls gave way to raw support columns, then to old ferrocrete pores thick with mineral weeping, then finally to bedrock galleries where the hand of man and the skin of the planet were mortared together in uneasy marriage. Our lamps cut narrow tunnels through the black. Heat breathed upward. Dust drifted like grey spores. Jorek carried the melter packs and complained continuously in a low mutter that told me he was afraid. Malrech moved behind him with the long last slung and a shotgun borrowed for close work. Serev had left the main Vox set behind and carried only a compact signal unit that made little whining noises whenever interference swept through the stone. Hestin walked ahead with Auspex canes extended, mechadendrites tasting the air like metal snakes. We found the first labor gang before we found the overseers. They were chained in files through a widened excavation throat, naked but for rag strips and harness scars, their backs bent. Beneath ore sledges, laden not with ore, but spoil and shattered masonry. Their skin had the waxy pallor of men who live below light. Most were imperial citizens once, perhaps Helicon stock, perhaps taken from the outer hives. It no longer mattered. Their ankles were linked in groups, and iron collars bit so deep into some throats that scar tissue had grown over the lower rims. No one spoke as they passed us in the dark because their tongues had been removed. Jorek swore softly. Even he had no joke for that. We shadowed the gang deeper, and the tunnel opened into a chamber so large our lamp beams failed to define it. Machinery throbbed within the dark, grotesque silhouettes of drill housings, conveyor moors, pump rigs and support cranes cobbled together from imperial industrial stock and blasphemous additions better left undescribed. Brass-rimmed pressure cylinders sweated steam. Cable bundles lay like intestines across the floor. Great auger heads still hot from work ticked as they cooled. And there, among the machinery, stood the overseers. Iron warriors. Not many. They did not need to be. 3 of them on a gallery gantry above the works, their armor blackened by rock dust, helm lenses turning in slow appraising movements as labor gangs moved below. Around them bustled mortal engineers in scavenged void suits, iron-masked slaves, and gun servitors slaved to fixed arcs along the excavation throat. The traitor Astartes watched it all with the terrible concentration of men building a cathedral out of murder. We crouched in a fissure of broken support stone and listened. One of the iron warriors held a data slate in a gauntlet the size of my chest. Another was tracing structural lines along the gallery wall with a stylus that hissed where it touched. The third looked down into the dark, where the deeper tunnel ran on ahead of the chamber, descending at an angle beneath the hive. Compaction remains acceptable, the first said. Advance the bore by another 40 meters before the next stress reading. The second answered, the foundation braces are not the true prize. No, said the third, and there was a dead amusement in that voice which chilled me more than any battle cry could have. Every fortress contains its confession. You only need enough pressure to hear it. They spoke as artisans might, as masons discussing where to place the next chisel stroke. Hestin's mechadendrite tightened around my forearm until metal pinched flesh. He pointed with one claw toward the support columns nearest the bore chamber. Set charges there, the gesture meant. Bring the roof down on the machinery. I nodded. We spread in silence. For 3 good minutes, I believed we might do it cleanly. Malrech took position behind a slaglip with the shotgun. Jorek crawled toward the first column, dragging a melter charge through slurry. Serev knelt beside Hestin at a cable trunk to place a disruptor bundle. I moved toward the central support arch, counting breaths and footing, every sound magnified by the dark. Then, one of the tongueless laborers saw us. Perhaps he thought we were salvation, perhaps only another shape in the black. He lurched sideways with a strangled cry of breath through throat scar, and a servitor gun snapped toward him in reflex. Its lamps swept over me. The chamber erupted. Shotguns in tunnels do not sound like ordinary weapons. They are avalanches compressed into a trigger pull. Malrech's first blast tore an iron-masked overseer off a catwalk. My laser stitched fire across a servitor faceplate. Jorek rose from a crawl to a charge and planted his melter pack against the nearest column with both hands, roaring like an animal. Hestin triggered the disruptor bundle, and half the chamber lighting died, plunging everything into strobing muzzle flash and red emergency lumen. The Iron Warriors answered instantly. Bolter fire in enclosed rock is not merely loud, it is intimate. Each shell seemed to detonate inside my lungs. Stone spat shards. Slaves exploded in red bursts where rounds struck them. One of the traitor Marines dropped from the gantry with impossible weight and landed among the labor gangs, killing 2 beneath his boots. He fired one-handed as he moved, each shot exact, each burst chosen to herd us away from the bore machinery and toward a cross chamber where the roof hung cracked and unstable. He was solving us even in combat. "Left support," I shouted. "Bring down the left support." Jorek heard me. Blessed, stupid Bale heard me through the storm and hammered the detonator rune. The melter charge fired. The column became light. Stone around it ran bright and then failed. A sheet of the gallery roof dropped in a roar of broken ferrocrete and hot dust, crushing servitors, laborers, and one whole section of conveyor rig. The chamber shook. Men screamed beneath the collapse. For a heartbeat, I thought we had won enough space to escape. Then the deeper bore woke. Something vast shrieked from the tunnel beyond, a metal bellow layered over with the unmistakable cadence of warp-voiced anger. Heat rolled out in a blast. Red lumens flickered as if in fear. The demon-bound engine driving the excavation had felt the damage and turned its attention toward us. Prometheum burst from somewhere to my right. One of our reserve sappers, a line engineer attached to us from another section, had gone up with his flamer when bolter fire struck the tanks. Fire sheeted across the chamber ceiling. Chains snapped. Tongueless slaves ran burning into the dark. The Iron Warriors kept firing through them. We fought by instinct then. There is no doctrine deep enough to remain clean in such conditions. Malrech's shotgun boomed until it clicked empty, and then he was in among them with an entrenching tool, chopping at wrists and throats in flashes of orange light. Serev dragged a wounded sapper by the collar while trying to keep his compact Vox from smashing against the rock. Hestin shoved a data spike into a machinery nexus and began chanting Binharit curses as sparks blew around his face. I saw Jorek take a shovel blade to the teeth of an iron-masked overseer and then vanish beneath a rain of stone when another section of roof caved in. I heard men buried alive, not one scream, but dozens, cut off in layers under hot rubble and snapped rebar. The dust turned the air into paste. Every breath scraped. "Back!" I shouted again, though there was barely any direction left in the world. "Back to the access throat." Hestin seized my arm. "No," he clicked. "Look." Through the smoke and shifting dust, I saw what he meant. The main bore tunnel did not continue toward the wall foundations alone. A secondary shaft, newly cut and shored, angled away beneath the western districts, with obsessive reinforcement and insulated piping running along its length. Not toward the curtain braces, not toward the gate engine. Deeper, inward, into the hive's gut. Hestin's Auspex rune strip flickered. He fed it power, coughed blood through his rebreather grill, and thrust the display before my eyes. Hydraulic mains, purification feeds, reclaimed circulation arteries, the water cycling core. For a moment the siege rearranged itself inside my skull. The shelling, the sealed gates, the pressure of billions trapped in heat and filth, the warm metallic taste in the water. The Iron Warriors had not come only for stone. They were driving beneath the hive's thirst, poison the reserves, ruin the cycling core, let panic and dehydration soften what artillery had not yet opened. They meant to make us drink the siege before they breached it. Another blast rolled through the chamber. The demon boar screamed again, closer now, and the dark ahead flushed red as furnace light spilled around the bend. I looked down the secondary tunnel toward the hidden arteries of Helicon and understood with a clarity that made fear almost holy. The walls were not the first thing they intended to kill. The order for the counteroffensive came 3 days after we discovered the tunnels beneath the western districts, and a day after the first cases of blackwater fever began to move through the lower habs in numbers too large for medici tallies to matter. Hive Command did not call it desperation. Men in polished rooms never do. The proclamation that reached the trench galleries named it a corrective action, a righteous thrust, a restoration of initiative blessed by the Emperor's light. It stated that the enemy siege line had overextended in pursuit of bombardment supremacy. It stated that a decisive blow against the western batteries would shatter their pressure against Helicon before hunger, contamination and structural fatigue finished what the guns had begun. It stated a great many things in the language of banners and duty. What it meant was simpler. We were rotting faster than they were. Captain Oren Thas gave me the order in a shell-damaged command alcove where a leaking pipe tapped hot water into a bucket no one had emptied because every man in the room was too tired to notice the sound anymore. "You are attached to the 3rd Assault Column," he said, shoving the slate into my hands. "Sapper detachment, breach work, obstacle clearance, demolition of captured artillery where possible." "Captured," I repeated. Thas looked at me with eyes that had forgotten how to blink politely. "You have questions, Sergeant?" "Yes, Captain. That is unfortunate." I glanced down the slate. The assault formation sprawled over page after page of unit marks and revised attachments. Line infantry regiments stripped from sectors already judged unsalvageable. Penal cohorts collared and shock-chained in their staging pens. Arbitrators with suppression mauls and execution teams embedded to maintain forward momentum. Combat servitors assigned as living shields and breach. Assets. A few surviving tanks, more patchwork than machine by then, and what remained of the Western artillery to cover the advance. It was not an army gathered for victory. It was everything Helicon still had that could walk, fire, or be pushed into the enemy. "We found their tunnel line," I said. "Their water target. If we spend men on this and fail, if we do nothing, we fail with greater orderliness." Thas leaned closer. "Listen to me, Voss. By next week, there will be riots in every sealed quarter where the shelling has not already spared us the trouble. The water reclaim is degrading. The outer sanctums are on half rations. The bastions are gone. We break their artillery pressure now, or this hive dies without ever seeing the enemy parapets. It may die anyway." He gave a humorless smile. "That is war. Go prepare your men." My men. By then the phrase had become a habit more than a truth. Ven was buried below the western wall. Malrech still lived, but his ruined face had drawn him inward until speech came from him only when shooting could not serve. Jorek had healed badly and too fast, stitched together by battlefield chirurgeons with the crude confidence of men spending flesh that was not theirs. Seraph Kull had taken to sleeping with his vox set across his chest like a devotional relic. Heston Rowe remained with us because every engineer below the level of full Magos seemed eventually to get folded into whatever emergency had the most teeth. Brack joined the column too, painted afresh with kill sigils by some diligent hand in the Ogren pens. He had a new ripper gun, heavier than the last, and smiled when he saw the massing troops. Big push, he said. Yes. Many men. Yes. He nodded with solemn approval, as if a proper war had at last decided to begin. We staged in the western transit sinks where freight rails once carried munitions from the foundries to the parapets. Now the loading bays were packed, with bodies and machinery enough to make breathing difficult. Penal troops stood in linked files with explosive collars blinking red at their throats. Their uniforms had been stripped to marked fatigues and prayer numbers. Some muttered to themselves. Some laughed. One simply stared upward and bit the inside of his cheek until blood ran down his chin. The arbitrators watched them in black carapace, shock mauls held across their chests, faceplates blank as shrine-stone. Combat servitors loomed between the columns, augmetic limbs loaded with breacher drills, slab shields, and rotary cannons. Their flesh parts twitched in meaningless scraps of remembered humanity. One had tears leaking from the corners of his deadened eyes while a loader tech locked a chain blade mount into place where his left arm had once been. Jorek took it all in and scratched at the scar tissue beneath his collar. Comforting, he said. Nothing says salvation like giving murderers collars and telling them which direction to run. That is not their role, Heston clicked from behind his respirator. Jorek looked over his shoulder. You mean the shock maul boys or the servitors? Both are machine functions within a greater operational whole. That is the most mechanicus answer ever vomited out of a metal throat. Serev was hunched over his Vox harness, trying to separate command channels from the endless static wash that rolled in from the west. Signal is filth. They're flooding every frequency again. They always do, I said. Not like this. This is layered contamination. False range marks. Spoofed retreat calls. They want the attack deaf before it leaves the gate. They want a great many things, Jorek muttered. Perhaps they should queue. When the blast doors opened, the whole hive seemed to exhale us into war. The counteroffensive moved with such mass that at first it felt unstoppable. That is the danger of large attacks. For the EU, first minutes they make, even the doomed believe in momentum. Thousands of boots pounded the causeways. Tanks rolled in columns so close their side armor scraped sparks from the barriers. Artillery behind us fired in sheets, turning the horizon into a wall of pulsing orange. Smoke generators vomited cover into the dawnless air. Penal units were driven ahead at shockmaul point, their handlers bellowing oaths and threats. The line regiments came after in dense waves, bayonets fixed, standards streaming soot. Brack and the other Ogrins lumbered among them like moving bunker walls. Servitors strode forward under impacts that would have flayed a man to the spine. For a little while, it worked. The battlefield vanished beneath us. There was too much movement, too much armor, too many guns firing for the land itself to remain visible. Razor wire disappeared under trampled bodies and track plates. Trenches vanished in smoke. The enemy's forward skirmish lines were overrun in places, before they could fall back in good order. We reached the first berms and took them. I saw penal troops throw themselves onto the enemy wire just to make bridges of their own bodies for the soldiers behind. I saw a servitor absorb an entire heavy stubber burst into its shield and keep walking until an anti-armor round removed its torso from its legs. I saw men cheer because the enemy trenches ahead looked thinly manned and badly linked, because sections of revetment seemed unfinished, because at last, there appeared a seam. That was the bait. Later, when I replayed it in my skull during the sleepless hours, I understood how carefully the weak point had been built. The trench line bent just enough to suggest haste. The parapet angles left an inviting corridor between two shell-smashed mounds. The wire was thinner there, the return fire lighter. Even the earth itself seemed more passable, cratered, but not drowned. Everything about it spoke to a commander's hunger for relief and a desperate infantryman's need to believe there was a path. We poured into it exactly as they intended. The first sign was silence, not total silence. No such thing exists on a battlefield, but the wrong silence. The forward enemy guns slackened. The visible trench defenders melted back too cleanly. Our own officers began shouting that we had them, that their line was folding, that one last push would split the western batteries wide open. Then the ground markings flared. Range stakes we had taken for shattered supports ignited in cold red lines. Marker lamps buried in mud flashed beneath the smoke. Somewhere ahead, a vox burst in machine cant signaled a completed calculation. "Down," Malrech said beside me, the one word flattened by horror. The world opened. Hidden Medusa batteries spoke from masked emplacements beyond the smoke bank, their shells arriving not in ragged ranging patterns, but in exact, overlapping arcs across the corridor we had packed with men. Trench mortars woke on both flanks, hurling airburst fragmentation into the densest knots of our advance. Minefields, buried under churned corpses, and mud detonated in linked belts, cutting rear movement from front movement in a chain of fire and torn flesh. Cross-locked heavy bolter nests opened from bunkers sunk invisibly into the berms on either side, stitching the trapped assault columns from flank to flank until men folded in rows as neat as harvest grain. The corridor became a killing chamber. It happened in minutes, not because we broke quickly, but because no mortal formation could have withstood that architecture of murder and remained a formation at all. One tank ahead of me took a Medusa round through the turret ring and burst like a lantern made of meat. Penal troops ran backward and forward at once, their collars detonating as handlers lost control of the line. Arbitrators waded in among them with shock mauls crackling, beating convicts toward the front until mortar. Bursts tore the black-armoured judges apart with the same indifference shown to everyone else. Servitors advanced until mine blasts took their legs, then crawled on blade arms through the mud, still trying to reach coordinates that no longer existed. "Left flank is gone," Serev shouted, then looked at his vox slate as if he no longer trusted the words on it. "No, not gone. Blank. Emperor, I can't read anything." Jorek fired his shotgun into the smoke, where heavy bolter tracers stitched across us in murderous lattice work. "Read this!" he snarled, and pumped another shell into the chamber. Brack bellowed and charged ahead, ripper gun thundering, smashing aside a section of wire where half a dozen men had become tangled and were being cut to ribbons by flanking fire. For an instant, the giant looked invincible, a slab of stubborn imperial flesh advancing through the storm. Then the demon engine came. At first, I thought it another breacher tank pushing through the haze. Then I saw the shape of it. A low siege engine plated in brass and iron, its front end built around a grinding scoop edged with chain teeth and hooked blades. The hull was layered with old kill marks, 8 pointed brands and skulls riveted into the plating so deeply they must have been hammered in while still wet. Furnace ports along its flanks breathed red. Something inside it howled in tones too eager to be merely mechanical. Khorne had touched that machine. It ploughed through men and razor wire alike, not with the clean indifference of a proper engine, but with a savage hunger that made a mockery even of Iron Warrior's restraint. Bodies went into the scoop and came out as thrown gobbets. I saw one penal trooper vanish waist-deep into the turning maw and then explode upward in a fan of ribs and steaming loops of intestine. Another man struck the front plate and slid beneath it, only for a spray of blood and crushed bone to jet from the side vents like overflow from a slaughterhouse. Drain. The demon engine carved a path straight through the trapped ranks, harvesting, grinding, spattering the churned earth with such force that the mud itself turned red-black and clotted. No man nearby held his courage against that thing. Courage is a story officers tell after battles. In the instant, there is only what the body can endure before it runs. Some officers tried to order retreat. I heard one captain on the rear slope screaming for a fallback to the secondary berm. Another had climbed half out of a wrecked chimera to wave his sidearm toward the hive, shouting that the corridor was lost. Commissar Holt Skane shot them both before the second order could fully leave their mouths. His bolt pistol cracked through the bombardment with impossible clarity. The first officer's head vanished in a red smear, the second toppled backward over the hull lip with half his chest gone. Skane did not even glance at the bodies. He strode the line as if he had chosen this hell, personally and found it acceptable. "Forward!" he roared. "Forward or die where you kneel." As though summoned by that blasphemous defiance, Confessor Malrech appeared through the smoke. Half his face was gone. I do not mean scarred, not blackened prettily as chapel pics like to portray martyrdom. Shrapnel had torn away the cheek, ear, and part of the lower jaw on his left side, leaving teeth naked beneath flayed muscle and one eye boiled blind in its socket. Blood soaked the red of his stole until it seemed he wore a wound instead of cloth. Yet he still had his staff, and he still screamed prayers in a voice that should have belonged only to the dead. "Stand," he thundered. "Stand in the sight of terror. Stand in agony. Stand because the Emperor sees the man who remains, when all softer flesh has burned away." Men did stand. Not all, never all, but enough to buy a few more minutes of slaughter. We pushed, because there was nothing else to do. Some portion of the assault reached the first real enemy trench line and fought there among timber braces, shell crates, and corpse-filled sumps. I killed 2 traitor auxilia with my bayonet, and a third with the butt of my laser gun when the weapon jammed with mud and blood. Jorek shattered an iron-masked overseer's knee with his breacher maul, and then beat his face to slurry against the parapet wall. Serev huddled in a fire step trying to raise anyone, on a clear command band, while rounds cracked overhead. It was there, in the lee of a wrecked ammunition hoist, that I found the engineer Surf. He had been hit low through the abdomen, perhaps by shrapnel, perhaps by one of our own ricochets. His entrails were in his lap. His mask had cracked away to show a narrow human face beneath, tattooed with cog marks and Legion numerals seared into the skin. One arm was augmetic from the elbow down, fitted not for war but for labour, a cluster of gripping claws and gauge needles slick with his own blood. He tried to pull himself toward a data slate lying just out of reach. I levelled my laser gun at him. He looked up, saw the barrel, and did not beg for his life. "Please," he rasped. Blood bubbled at his teeth. "Please, permit continued service." I stared. "To the 4th, he said, voice breaking with urgency. "Do not waste function. I can still calibrate. I can still mark load values. Please." The pleading in him was not human in the way I understood humanity. No appeal to mercy, no prayer, no curse, only terror that he might die without further usefulness to his masters. I shot him through the eye. His body twitched once, hand still reaching for the slate, then lay still in the mud among shell splinters and lengths of someone else's intestine. Around me, the counteroffensive continued to die. Retreat, when it finally came, was not given by command. It was granted by physics. Too many of us were dead. Too many guns were gone. Too much earth had been taught to murder any man who remained upon it. Those who lived began to crawl, stagger, or drag themselves back toward Helicon through a landscape that no longer resembled battle so much as the opened interior of a giant carcass. I remember the crawl more than the fight. Severed limbs lay in the craters like discarded tools, hands still gripping rifles, boots still attached to lower legs with no owner anywhere near. Men with burst lungs coughed pink froth into the ash and tried to breathe enough for 1 more meter. Crater water had turned the colour of butcher's slop, pink with blood, grey with pulverised stone, and filmed over with promethium where burning fuel had spread. I slid through that water on my belly because standing drew fire. Once, my hand landed on a human face beneath the surface, soft and eyeless. Jorek dragged Malrech for part of the way until Malrech ordered him to stop wasting strength and walk on. Brak carried no one this time. Even he had limits. His ripper gun was gone and one whole shoulder plate had been torn off, leaving flesh beneath scored open to the muscle. He still looked offended rather than afraid. At the last stretch before the hive berms, I rolled into the lee of a dead servitor and looked back. The enemy line had not surged forward in triumph. No wild pursuit came. No exultation. Through the smoke, I could just make out the methodical activity already beginning where our assault had broken. Range poles reset. casualty recoverers moving, ammunition carriers redirected, new gun emplacements opening where old ones had merely been decoys. The corridor that had seemed weak was being rebuilt even as our survivors crawled away from it. That was when I understood the fullest obscenity of the thing. The Iron Warriors were not merely stronger than us. Strength was the shallowest truth. They had measured not only our walls, our trenches, our artillery habits, and our ration thresholds. They had mapped us, our urgency, our fear of thirst, our need for a breach in pressure, our readiness to believe in a weak seam because despair always makes bait of hope. The corridor had not only been built to kill bodies, it had been built for the mind of the besieged. They knew what we would choose before we chose it. By the time I reached the gates of Helicon again, crawling through mud made from blood and ash, I understood that we were not fighting an enemy who happened to use fortification. We were trapped inside the thoughts of engineers who had made cruelty into a geometry and taught the world to obey it. The wall opened at shift change, without trumpet, omen, or any last clean instant in which a man might understand that the thing he had trusted all his life had ceased to exist. One moment the western curtain still stood. It had been cracked, flayed, cratered and scorched by weeks of bombardment, its upper parapets gnawed down to ragged teeth and its galleries packed with dust, wounded men and repair crews working like rats inside a dying machine. Yet it still stood. That mattered. In a siege, walls become theology. Men forgive hunger, stench, fever, executions, corpse rations, and black water, so long as stone remains between themselves and the enemy. A wall is not just a barrier. It is the last lie told in a voice large enough for everyone to believe it. Then the lie broke. I was in the lower manufacturum transit beneath the western districts when the first sign came, a deep convulsion underfoot, unlike artillery. Not the downward hammer of shells, but an upward heave, as though some immense thing beneath the hive had shouldered its way against the roots of the city. Every pipe in the corridor rang at once. Bolts spat from a support collar. The lumen strips burst in a spray of white sparks. Heston Rowe looked up from an inspection terminal and made a noise I had only ever heard from him once before, down in the tunnel works. It was not fear, it was outrage. Subsurface detonation, he snapped. Multiple. Emperor preserve the load columns. The second sign was sabotage. Somewhere along the internal maintenance lattice, hidden charges went off in rapid succession, not large enough to announce themselves as a separate attack, just enough to kill braces already weakened, cut emergency seals, break feeder conduits, and ruin every redundant support the masons of older centuries had built into the curtain base. We learned later that collaborators had laid some of those charges years before, buried inside repairs, left sleeping in the walls like cysts. At the time, all we knew was that the Western District suddenly seemed full of cracking stone and men shouting conflicting orders over a voxnet that had dissolved into screams. The third sign was the enemy's answer from outside. Macro cannon fire struck the same section of wall in a precision sequence so perfect it made my stomach turn. First, the upper facing, then the midline galleries, then the buried core. Each impact timed to land, just as the internal structure shifted from the sabotage and the charges below. The whole section of curtain shuddered once, bent inward with impossible slowness, and then came down on the city. There was no single sound for it. A collapse on that scale becomes weather, earthquake, and judgment all at once. The western wall of Hive Helicon folded inward in a continent of stone and ferrocrete, taking gun decks, trench galleries, support towers, munitions lifts, and everyone inside them into one roaring cloud. The air in the Manufactorum district went black. The concussion slapped me flat and dragged all the breath from my lungs. Somewhere nearby, a boiler line burst, filling the corridor with steam that smelled of rust and blood. Men vanished in the dust before they had time to scream. When I got to my knees, the hive was still moving. Not from shelling, from failure. Whole sections of the adjacent districts were sagging as load transferred through fractured support bones. Conveyor, towers leaned. Crane gantries tore loose and came down across the avenues. A tank in the avenue beyond us caught half across a transit bridge when the collapse struck, simply dropped through the cracked decking and hung there for a second, with its treads spinning above nothing, before another impact took it full on and blew the hull apart. Burning track links cartwheeled through the smoke. One struck a running man and cut him in half at the waist. "All sections!" Captain Thass's voice barked over the command band, filtered through static and agony. "Western curtain has failed. Western curtain has failed. Interior lines to seal and hold. Repeat, hold interior lines. Do not allow a rush into the manufacturing ward." As if the enemy needed permission. The breach became visible in fragments as the dust shifted. Where the wall had stood, there was now a canyon of broken stone opening directly into the outer kill fields. Fires burned among the fallen blocks. Tanks trapped in. The collapse belched smoke through ruptured engine decks. Men staggered through the rubble, only to vanish under fresh shell bursts, or beneath the boots of panicked crowds, fleeing deeper into the hive. Thousands died before the enemy even crossed the threshold. Stampedes killed more. The roads choked instantly with refugees, work crews, line infantry, medici carts, half-functional servitors and officers trying to push everything in opposite directions at once. I saw a whole knot of civilians crushed against a mag rail barrier as soldiers tried to drive them away from the breach. Their ribs went under the pressure with dry snapping sounds. Those behind kept pushing because those farther behind could not see what they were pressing people into. Then the Iron Warriors came through, not charging, not exultant, advancing. They entered the gap behind mobile mantlets tall as hab walls, slabs of riveted armor dragged on tracked undercarriages to shield the first waves from surviving. Interior guns. Shielded breacher tanks crawled behind them, wide-snouted machines with dozer rams, siege shields, and muzzle housings built for short-range demolition. Between and before them came slave waves. Human bodies in collars and harnesses, driven in thick, disciplined masses by overseers and shock prods, sent first to trigger mines, draw fire, and reveal surviving firing points. Some still wore Imperial work marks on their backs. Some stumbled over the broken wall and disappeared under our guns. More kept coming, because there were always more. "They are spending flesh to buy data," Heston said, his augmetic eye whirring as it tracked the advance. Jorek spat blood into the dust. I noticed. Our orders came fast after that. My sapper remnant, what remained of Jorek, Serev, Malrech, Heston and Brak, was assigned to hold an interior defense line in Manufactorum District Ferrum 9, a belt of conveyor halls, crucible chambers, and assembly vaults that lay just behind the collapsed curtain sector. The district had once built shell casings, rail couplings, and low-grade industrial plate. Now its production lines stood cold, its drainage channels clogged with ash, grease, and the swollen dead washed there by burst pipes and blast runoff. We ran to the line through a city already becoming a battlefield. Ferrum 9 was a maze of iron catwalks, furnace pits, gantries and conveyor lanes wide enough for cargo haulers. Molten runoff channels still glowed in places where emergency shutdown had failed, turning the murk orange beneath the smoke. Corpse-clogged drainage ditches lined the lower passages, blocked with workers, soldiers and servitors crushed in the collapse. Their bodies had packed so tightly in some culverts that floodwater ran over them rather than around them. One man in an administratum coat still moved inside such a jam, eyes wide, mouth opening and closing, as the weight of the dead pinned him in place. Captain Thass met us near an overturned shell loader and stabbed a gloved finger down the main production corridor. "You hold there," he said. "Conveyors, crucible approaches, and the loading bridge. If they cut through Ferrum 9, they roll straight into the transit sanctums. No retreat without my order." "What reserves?" I asked. He gave me the kind of look men save for bad jokes at funerals. "You are looking at them." We set firing positions among the conveyor housings. Malrech took a gantry with lines of sight down the main corridor and across the crucible floor. Jorek hauled ammunition crates into a breastwork with brute force and bloody determination, his old chest wound leaking fresh through the field dressings. Serev strung a local Vox relay through hanging chain feeds, while muttering at the interference, like a man trying to bully a ghost. Brack planted himself in the central approach with his ripper gun and a grin, as content as if this were a training yard. The first enemy units entering Ferrum. 9 were not Astartes. They were cult infantry, an auxilia forced ahead of the breaching elements, men and women alike in rags, armor scraps and industrial masks, driven through the smoke by overseers and fear. We cut them down in swathes. Lasfire flashed from our positions. Brack's ripper gun hammered bodies apart with such force that limbs spun free into the conveyors. Malrech's shots picked the handlers and Vox carriers first. Jorek laughed once, a raw, ugly bark, when a whole knot of charging fanatics pitched together into a drainage trench and vanished under the corpse jam already choking it. Then the real killers arrived. I saw them first through a break in the furnace smoke at the far end of the district, moving between the mantlets with the slow inevitability of siege engines given flesh. Iron warriors in soot-dark plate, hazard bands dulled by ash, bolters held low, as if even now ammunition economy mattered more than spectacle. With them came the figures who would burn, who themselves into my memory whether I wished it or not. Warsmith Vorak Drael stood behind the first rank like a commander inspecting a work site. He was larger than the others, his armor layered and plated until he seemed less a warrior than a walking bastion. His helm was severe, slit-lensed, with none of the grotesque flourishes lesser traitors favored. A cloak of shredded industrial fabric hung from one pauldron, heavy with soot. He did not shout. He watched. At his right moved a warpsmith whose mechadendrites rose from his back in a hooked fan, like spinal cords torn free and given lives of their own. The metal tendrils ended in cutters, probes, welding claws and injector spikes, all twitching with obscene anticipation. Servo skulls and severed machine spirits hung from his harness in cages. He turned his head once toward the broken conveyors, and I saw one of the mechadendrites taste the air, as though even the district's ruin carried information. At Vorak's left came a siege captain carrying a gravhammer across one shoulder. The weapon's head was black, blocky and brutal, cased in field coils that bled blue distortion into the smoke. He moved with the contemptuous ease of something that has never needed to hurry toward human death, because human death always waits where it is told. Above them, on a damaged conveyor bridge, a squad of Havocs took position without a word. Their heavy weapons tracked the district with predatory patience, while one of them fed range data down to the line below in bursts of Binharic and clipped Gothic. No challenges, no boasts, only work. Advance by section, one Iron Warrior said, as their first rank reached the loading lanes. Burn that nest, said another, pointing not at us broadly, but at Malrech's exact gantry position. Waste no shells on the dying, said the Gravhammer captain, and that was all the permission their guns required. The firefight that followed was industrial slaughter. Heavy, bolters hammered the gantries until the railings came apart in red spray and sparks. A chemflamer washed one conveyor embankment in blue fire, turning 3 of our attached line troopers into shrieking silhouettes that stumbled blind into a crucible lip and went over. Breacher tanks slammed shells into support columns, each impact sending tremors through the whole district. Slave waves kept coming in ragged masses ahead of the Astartes, dying to reveal our arcs. Their bodies piling into makeshift berms, the Iron Warriors advanced behind without once acknowledging the source of the cover. We held because Thas held. That is the plain truth. He strode the line, pistol in one hand, saber in the other, dragging squads into new angles when old ones collapsed, kicking wounded men upright if they could still shoot, and shooting them himself if they tried to run. Once I saw him plant his boot on a toppled servitor and use its wreck as a firing rest while ordering a munitions train detonated, to block the lower approach. He did not waste breath on inspiration, only positioning. Brack bought us time with his life. A corridor on the southern side of Ferrum 9, little more than a service throat between two shell presses, was overrun by cult infantry and trench rabble pushing toward our flank. If they came through there in numbers, they would roll our whole line from the side. Brack saw it before anyone gave the order. He roared, charged into the corridor, and planted himself across its width like a living blast door. The Ripper gun thundered. Bodies came apart against the walls. The front ranks of cultists vanished in red mist and thrown meat. Those behind slipped in the gore and piled over one another, while Brack laughed in that huge innocent way of his and kept firing. Even when the ammunition drum ran dry, he did not yield. He dropped the gun and went to his fists, breaking skulls, ripping men apart by the shoulders, using one shrieking fanatic as a club against another. We might have saved him if the enemy had been less exact. The Iron Warriors marked the corridor. 2 crack missiles punched into the wall on either side of Brack and blew the press housing outward in a rain of bolts and steel shards. He staggered, but did not fall. Then Chainblade fighters rushed in under the smoke. Not maddened berserkers, but disciplined killers using the moment correctly. I saw Brack seize one and tear him in half from groin to sternum. I saw another bury a chainblade into the Ogren's thigh deep enough to spray bone chips across the corridor. Then the Gravhammer captain himself stepped to the opening and signalled once. A final crack round hit Brack square in the chest. The Ogren came apart against the service throat in hacked meat, torn flak, shattered bone, and a wash of blood so broad it painted both walls. The corridor was blocked with him. For a few more precious moments, even dead, Brack held. Jorek saw it and went very still. Then a shell fragment took him. It came from a breacher, round smashing a crane stanchion above our line. The detonation turned the support into a spinning storm of metal. A shard the length of my forearm punched through Jorek's left side and tore out near the spine, taking armor, flesh, and something deeper with it. He dropped to one knee with a sound I'd never heard from him before. Not pain exactly, but offended disbelief. I crawled to him through shell casings and blood. "Stay down." "Shut up," he hissed, clutching the ruin of his flank with one hand and reaching for a fresh drum with the other. A medici orderly tried to jab him with morphia. Jorek backhanded the injector away so hard it broke on the floor plates. "No," he snarled through his teeth. "No haze, no sleep. Give me ammunition and a sightline." The orderly looked at me. "Do it," I said. So we propped him behind a shattered conveyor housing with 2 extra charge packs, a shotgun, and a lane down the central floor. He sat there white as ash, guts held inside by pressure and hatred, and kept firing every time a traitor shape crossed his vision. I think stubbornness alone kept him breathing. The fallback order came an hour later, or perhaps 10 minutes. Time was ruined by then. Captain Thass's voice cut over the local net, flayed by static. "All remaining sections pull to Transit Seal 4. Repeat, pull to Transit Seal 4. District Ferrum is lost." That meant leaving half the western hab blocks and the lower industrial sanctums unevacuated. We heard them when the blast doors began to cycle. Civilians, workers, families trapped in the feeder corridors beyond the transit seals, pounding with bare fists, tools, ration tins, anything they had, on the closing adamant shutters. The sound carried even through battle noise, because desperation has a rhythm artillery never quite drowns. Men shouted for mercy. Children screamed. Someone on the far side of one door recited the Imperial Creed at the top of his lungs until the words broke into sobbing. The door kept closing. Serev flinched as if struck. Malrech did not look that way at all. Hestin stared at the seal mechanism with the expression of a priest witnessing a necessary abomination. I felt my own boots trying to turn toward the sound and forced them not to. If we opened the doors, the retreat lane would die in a crush and the enemy would flood the transit sanctum behind us. If we left them shut, everyone beyond them was already condemned. That is the Imperium in one motion. A gate closes, A prayer is spoken, the useful live a little longer. We fell back through Ferrum 9 in fighting order, dragging Jorek between firing points whenever the line bent too close to him. Thas covered the final withdrawal himself with a knot of stormtroopers and what remained of the arbitrators. At one junction, he shot a panicked trooper trying to break toward a side stair, and then immediately turned the corpse into cover for the man beside him. Even Mercy had become recyclable. At the last loading bridge before Transit Seal 4, I looked back. The breach loomed through the manufacturum's smoke like the mouth of the world torn open. Iron Warrior's standards were rising over the broken curtain, stark against the flames, their hazard-marked iconography rigid in the furnace wind. More enemy guns were already being dragged through the gap. Mantlets rolled over rubble. Slave gangs swarmed the stonefall under whips and vox horns. Above them, the sky of Helicon had turned orange-black, not with sunset, but with industrial firestorms as refinery lines burned, promethium tanks cooked off, and the western districts fed their own smoke into the heavens. The wall was gone. The enemy was inside, and the hive had begun to burn in its own breath. After the wall fell, the war stopped feeling like war, and began to feel like habitation. There is a particular horror in learning that a siege does not end when the enemy enters. Men who have lived their lives behind fortifications imagine the true terror will be the breach itself, the rush of guns, the alien iron in the streets, the sudden raw intimacy of close killing after weeks of distant bombardment. That terror is real, and I had seen enough of it by then to carry its shapes forever. But what followed inside Helicon was worse in a quieter way. The battle moved inward, yes, but so did every other cruelty men usually keep hidden behind doors. Hunger came into the corridors. Filth came into the shrines. Murder came into the ration queues. The siege began to wear a domestic face. The surviving population of the western sectors was driven deeper, compressed into lower sanctums, transit tunnels, maintenance crypts, and mag-rail sinks never meant to hold so much breathing flesh. The air down there tasted layered, as if every misery had left a residue. Promethium, blood, mold blooming in condensation seams. Reactor steam, hot enough to scald the lungs if a vent line burst nearby. The stale ammonia of overcrowded shelters where men had ceased pretending privacy existed. The sour sweetness of infected bandages. The copper tang of black water served warm from emergency cisterns. I moved through those sanctums on duty rotations and saw what Helicon was becoming. Shelter chambers filled with men too weak to stand but still clutching dented ration tins against their chests, as if theft in the night was certain, which it was. Families sleeping with knives hidden under blankets. Fever tents so crowded that the sick lay pressed thigh to thigh, coughing into each other's faces until whole rows took the same infection by morning. Corpses stripped not for funeral preparation, but for anything still useful. Boots removed, belts removed, coat lining cut free. In the worst corners, flesh removed. The first corpse thefts were blamed on medici requisition. The next were not. Men went missing from the dead carts and reappeared in stew vats 3 sanctums away under more respectable names. I saw a pair of line troopers beat a clerk to death over a half sleeve of stale ration wafers hard enough to crack teeth. I saw an old man strangle a boy with a prayer cord because the boy had taken his place in a steam vent niche where the warmth made sleep possible. I saw hab workers fight with sharpened spoons over scraps of plastic sheeting that could be turned into lean-tos against the drip from overhead pipes. Every human habit rotted into appetite. Even grief became possessive. Men guarded the bodies of their dead kin so they would not be taken before a priest could speak over them or a quartermaster could weigh them. The guns still sounded overhead. That never changed. It only moved farther away and became part of the architecture of daily life, like the pulse of the reactors or the coughing in the shelter rows. Children learned not to flinch at artillery, but to flinch at the word food. Confessor Malrech stalked those sanctums like a wound that had learned to walk. What remained of his face had not healed. The left side was a ruin of scarlet scar tissue, exposed teeth and one blind lidless eye that glistened under chapel light. He wore no proper medicae dressing over it now. Perhaps pride had denied it. Perhaps there had been none to spare. He moved through the press of bodies with censer smoke trailing from his staff and preached in a voice that seemed to rise from some furnace deeper than his own ruined lungs. Endure, he would thunder from the tops of ration crates and transit junctions. Endure, because weakness has no sacrament. Endure, because pain is only the body confessing that it was always lesser than the soul. Endure, because the God Emperor did not purchase your flesh so you could spend it on self-pity. Men listened because there was little else left to listen to. At first, his sermons drove them upright. I saw fists clench. I saw backs straighten. I saw starving workers force themselves through another labor detail, because Malrech had promised salvation not through survival, but through refusal to surrender inwardly. Yet even he began to sound different as the days passed. There were moments, usually at the ends of his tirades, when his voice would catch in a way that had nothing to do with the damage in his throat. He would pause after invoking the Emperor's witness and stare out over the shelter rows as if waiting for some answer that never came. Then he would roar again, louder, crueler, as though trying to drown the silence by force. The Iron Warriors found ways to make that silence heavier. They had begun using loudhailers mounted on captured hab towers and Vox hijacks seeded through our own damaged channels. The announcements came at all hours, flat machine-born voices, sometimes mortal, sometimes almost certainly Astartes, speaking with the same administrative calm a factorium adept might use to recite production quotas. Casualty estimate for Western sanctums exceeds 108,000. Structural stress readings indicate probable collapse in lower transit arteries within 30 standard hours. Command Officer Captain Oren Thass marked for termination. Commissar Holt Skane marked for termination. Confessor Malrech marked for termination. Compliance shortens suffering. The first time the enemy spoke Captain Thass's name over a hijacked chapel speaker, every head in the sanctum turned toward him. Not because any man meant betrayal in that moment, but because naming is power. The Iron Warriors understood that. They wanted us to hear the siege thinking about us. They wanted us to know our deaths had already been sorted into categories. Serev Kul spent what little sleep he still allowed himself, crouched over damaged sets and cable spools, separating truth from contamination. His hands had developed a fine tremor by then, never still, always feeling for some hidden rhythm in the static. One night in a transit pump room where the walls sweated warm rust water, he looked up from the receiver with eyes so bloodshot the whites had gone pink. "They are sequencing the shelling," he said. "We know that," Jorek muttered from his cot frame in the adjacent medici alcove. "They have been sequencing it since the walls were new." "No." Serev jabbed a finger at a scribbled slate covered in timings. "Not just military sectors, civilian zones, shelter rows, chapel districts. They rotate impact density across non-combat quarters, so no population block gets more than a few hours without concussion. Enough to prevent sleep, but not enough to waste ammunition on full collapse." I looked at the slate and saw he was right. The pattern spread through the hive like a blasphemous litany. Western lower sanctums one night, southern hab stacks the next. Old transit bunkers after that. Not annihilation, denial of rest. "They are shelling our sleep," I said. Serev gave a brittle laugh. "They are shelling our minds." By then, Jorek Bale was dying. He had refused every real treatment offered because real treatment required time, stock, and medici priority Helicon could no longer spare. The fragment wound in his flank had festered despite sealing foam and battlefield stitches. The flesh around it turned angry, then dark, then waxy. He sweated constantly. His jokes came slower, yet he still demanded a weapon within reach, still cursed anyone who suggested rest, still asked for a sightline any time the shelling intensified, as if he might yet rise and rejoin the line on spite alone. The medic alcove where they laid him was a repurposed equipment locker off one of the lower sanctum galleries. Canvas partitions sagged with mould. The air smelled of antiseptic, excrement, and hot metal. Men died there with such regularity, the orderlies had ceased lowering their voices. I sat with him when duty allowed, because there was too much noise elsewhere and because some debts are not orders but still have to be paid. On the last night he was lucid in a way that frightened me more than his fever mutterings had. He stared up at the rusted ceiling and said, "You know what I keep thinking about, Voss?" "No, not Karin, not Brak, not even the breach." He swallowed with effort. "I keep thinking about the ones who died under the wall when it came in, buried inside their own defense, crushed by the thing meant to keep them alive." I said nothing. He turned his head a little. The fever had burned the red from his cheeks, leaving him grey and old. "Do you think the Emperor still counts them?" he asked. "Men who die buried under their own walls. Does he count that as standing the line?" There is no correct answer to such a question in a dying hive. I could have given him the priest's answer. I could have told him yes, that the master of mankind counts every sacrifice and weighs every soul. I could have lied cleanly. Instead, I said, "He counts the men who stayed." Jorek thought about that. Then he gave the smallest ghost of a grin. "Good," he whispered. "Then let him count loud." He died before the next shift bell, one hand clenched around a charge pack he could no longer lift into a gun. I left the pack in his grip when the corpse detail came. There was nothing else worth preserving. The same day, we captured a militia overseer during a failed enemy probe in the lower junctions. He was no great warrior, just a hard-faced local man in scavenged flak, one arm augmetic, one ear missing, with the striped half-mask favoured by the Iron Warrior's human auxiliaries. Malrech shot him through the thigh while he was trying to fall back with a slate satchel. We dragged him into a pressure room between sanctum sectors, bound him to a valve chair, and let Heston inspect the satchel while Skarner conducted the questioning. Commissar Holtzskarn did not bellow. He did not need to. He simply placed the bolt pistol on the overseer's knee and began asking for names, routes, and liaison marks in a tone that suggested time itself had already condemned the prisoner, and only details remained. The overseer broke faster than I expected. Perhaps he had never truly believed the Iron Warriors would save him. Perhaps pain strips collaboration back to its original cowardice. Whatever the reason, he talked. He told us local guildsmen and underhive bosses had sold out portions of Helicon's schematics years before the fleet ever arrived. Utility routes, hab plans, service shafts, pressure door sequences, old maintenance maps, no current command archive even trusted anymore. He told us hidden sympathizers had embedded charges during peacetime repairs. He told us the enemy knew our districts not from observation alone, but because Helicon's own sons had sold them the hive's bones. Skane shot him through the mouth when he finished. No speech, no condemnation, just a single economical round that painted the pressure valve behind him with blood and broken teeth. Heston and I spent the next shift cycle destroying an internal cogitator vault because of what that man had confirmed. The vault lay beneath an administratum annex already half collapsed from bombardment, its lower chambers sealed behind coglocks and machine rights older than my regiment. Inside were targeting schematics, infrastructure maps, and emergency contingency overlays for sectors not yet fully breached. If the enemy took that data intact, they would no longer need collaborators for the inner sanctums. They would hold the hive's nervous system in their hands. Heston moved through the vault with a strange solemnity, mechadendrites whispering over brass housings and data spines. To him, destruction was a sacrament only when necessity purified it. "Remember this," he said as he armed the melter charges against the primary archive stacks. "A machine spirit slain by loyal hands is not desecration. It is martyrdom. You are getting poetic, I said. "You are getting sentimental." We worked in near darkness while bombardment tremors sifted old dust from the ventilation grills. The cogitator columns around us hummed softly, still alive, still holding maps of a city already dying outside their walls. I found myself touching one brass casing as we withdrew, as if apologizing to a wounded animal I'd been ordered to put down. The charges turned the vault into a white furnace. Data cores sagged, memory coils liquefied. Centuries of accumulated structural knowledge died in 10 seconds of engineered heat. Better ash than capture. The chapel stampede happened the following day. Word had spread through the lower sanctums that one of the old reliquary chapels was issuing uncut ration wafers to those who arrived for a public blessing. The rumor was false, or perhaps true at first, and then false once too many mouths converged on it. By the time I reached the transit crossing above the chapel, the pressure of bodies had already turned the stairwells into crushing funnels. Men shoved from behind because they believed food lay ahead. Men in front could not move because the doors below had jammed half shut. Children disappeared under boots. Someone fell against a rail and snapped it loose, sending 3 rows of people sideways into the press. The screaming changed then. It lost language. Skane arrived with a squad of enforcers and did what only a commissar can do in the Imperium when mass panic acquires a body. He shot the looters first, then the deserters trying to knife their way clear, then 2 men who were neither, but whose deaths created enough sudden space and fear for the crush to hesitate. The crowd broke around the bodies, the way floodwater breaks around rocks. Shock mauls followed. Enforcers dragged the living from the dead and kicked open an emergency side pressure door to vent the crush into a maintenance gallery. When it was over, the chapel steps were layered, with the trampled. Skane stood among them, with blood on his coat hem and smoke curling from the bolt pistol muzzle. For a time we said nothing. The enforcers hauled survivors away. A priest somewhere below recited absolution to a floor of broken ribs and flattened skulls. At last Skane said, not looking at me, "Do you know what is left, Sergeant?" I was too tired to guess. "No, Commissar." "Discipline." His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "Not courage, not faith. Those are luxuries that come and go. Discipline is what stands between a besieged city and cannibal madness." He holstered the pistol. "The enemy understands this. That is why they strike sleep, food, and order before they spend men on walls." Then he walked away to oversee the corpse tally. That night the water turned black, not everywhere at once. First in the lower sanctum taps, where the flow came out dark and oily enough that men thought the pipes had burst with sump backwash.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
Then, in the ration cisterns, where the surface film reflected chapel light in rainbow sheens and stank of alchemic rot. By second watch, the contamination alarms were screaming through the reclaim levels, and adepts in sealed masks were dragging testing rigs from one pumping station to the next, with the desperation of men who already knew the result. I filled a canteen at one emergency outlet before the valves were locked. The liquid inside was warm, thick. It carried a metallic taste under the chemical bitterness so foul I spat it out at once and still felt the residue burning the back of my throat. Heston took one look at the sample, ran his Auspex wand through it, and went absolutely still. "The cycling core has been breached," he said. No one in the room spoke. Around us, the sanctum pumps groaned, pushing poisoned water through the bowels of the hive. Somewhere deeper in Helicon, men were still filling cups, still mixing infant ration paste, still washing wounds, still trusting. The systems that had sustained the city for generations. I looked down into the blackness in my canteen and saw the tunnel again in memory. The secondary shaft angling beneath the foundations toward the hidden arteries of the hive. I had known then what the enemy meant to do, knowing it had changed nothing. The Iron Warriors had reached our thirst before they reached our hearts. I volunteered because there were too few reasons left not to. By then, the hive was dying in layers. Men still fought in the upper districts, still fed bodies into firing lines and prayers into chapel smoke, but Helicon had begun to fail beneath its own visible wounds. Water had gone black. The lower sanctums stank of chemical rot and fear sweat. Every day another transit artery sealed forever, another pump station flooded, another shelter block turned into a fever pit or a slaughter pen. The enemy had entered the city, yes, but that was only the face of the thing. Beneath us, in the old foundation dark, the real work continued. The drills bored, the chain gangs hauled. The hidden arteries of the hive were cut and poisoned and measured for collapse. Captain Oren Thas asked for volunteers to descend again and destroy the master tunnel network before it opened the hive wider than any wall breach ever could. No speech accompanied the request, no promise of survival, no false honor draped over the fact that the mission belonged to the condemned. Men looked at their boots. Men looked at the floor. Men looked anywhere but at the map slate showing the spread of subterranean incursions beneath the western sanctums. I stepped forward because I had heard the engine in the walls and could not pretend ignorance anymore. Seraph Kool stepped beside me because he had become a man who feared sleep more than death. Heston Rowe did not volunteer. He merely said, "I am going," in a tone that made refusal impossible. Malrech went because shooting from far away had failed to preserve anything worth keeping. 2 line engineers from the surviving sapper sections joined us, both hollow-eyed enough to be half ghosts already. Captain Thas assigned 3 stormtroopers to the party, men in scorched carapace with no visible illusions left, and gave us demolition loads enough to ruin a manufacturum's spine if we could place them where it mattered. "Find the central engine," he said. "Bring the roof down on it. If the tunnels are beyond collapse, destroy what you can and burn the routing data. No withdrawal priority over mission completion." "No extraction corridor?" Serev asked, not hopefully, merely out of technical habit. Thas stared at him for a second too long. "The hive is your extraction corridor." That was the closest thing to humor he had left. We descended through maintenance shafts choked with collapsed cabling and old brick dust, down where Helicon remembered being built. The formal architecture of the hive died around us level by level. Plated walls gave way to rough support stone. Numbered passages lost their signs. Pipe runs thickened and merged into sweating arteries of iron. The deeper we went, the hotter the air became, until every breath tasted of rust, machine oil, and the rank copper tang of deep-buried blood. Somewhere ahead and below, great mechanisms labored with the patient pulse of obscene industry. Our lamps reached only so far. Beyond their light, the underfoundations existed as suggestion and noise. Drips, distant grinding. The occasional scream cut short so quickly it seemed more memory than sound. The first shaft we took ended in a cave-in where old maintenance braces had buckled inward. We crawled through the fracture on our bellies, passing beneath a slab of load-bearing ferrocrete so cracked I could see the dust shifting down from its own weight. One of the stormtroopers crossed himself against the aquila, painted on his chest plate, before pulling through. No one mocked him. We had all become more religious, underground, even those of us too tired for true devotion. Beyond the collapse, the war beneath the hive opened before us. It was not a tunnel network in the way a sane engineer would mean the term. It was a second undercity carved in theft and blasphemy. Galleries widened into machine caverns braced with riveted steel arches hammered directly into bedrock. Side passages had been lined with corpse mortar, broken bones and slurry compacted into binding mass between plates and support timbers. Sacrificial pylons of iron and flensed flesh stood at junctions where the earth seemed weak, each one etched with machine runes and darkened by old blood. Conveyor channels ran overhead and beneath, carrying spoil, bodies, ammunition caskets, and unknown components towards some deeper heart. The walls sweated heat and oil alike. Every few meters we passed chain gangs of laborers hauling stone sledges, their necks linked, their backs striped raw, overseers pacing beside them with shock rods and tally slates. The Iron Warriors had not merely dug under Helicon. They had founded a fortress within its roots. We shadowed a spoil route deeper, killing only when silence demanded it. Malrech dropped a masked overseer with a suppressed shotgun blast and caught the falling body before it hit the floor. One of the stormtroopers garroted a chainmaster with piano wire scavenged from a broken signal rack. The labor gangs kept moving, eyes down, because men survive long in sieges by learning what not to witness. The deeper galleries grew hotter still. Steam vented from floor grates in shrieking bursts, pumps hammered. Once we passed a flesh-fed engine mounted in a recess beside the main line, a grotesque thing of pistons and vat tubes into which half-dead bodies had been inserted up to the sternum, their nervous spasms somehow helping to regulate pressure through a manifold tree of valves. Heston paused before it for one extra second, his mechadendrites twitching like the fingers of a priest trying not to strike a blasphemer. "Do not look at me like that," Serev whispered. "I was not looking at you," Heston replied. "You do not have to say it. I heard the thought. You hear too many things." That had become true. Serev walked with his compact receiver hanging dead at his chest, though there was nothing to receive down there but the vibration of machinery and the occasional burst of corrupted Binharik slipping through the rock. He kept glancing into side passages, as if expecting voices to form in the dark. Sleep deprivation had hollowed him into something all tendon and attention. The siege was using him up one whisper at a time. We found the central workings by sound before sight. The tunnel ahead broadened into a cathedral of industry so vast our lamp beams could not span it. Heat blasted from the opening in waves. The grinding pulse we had heard since entering the under foundations became a full bodily sensation, a beat that set teeth on edge and seemed to strike from inside the chest rather than the ears. The floor trembled with each cycle of the engine. Then we looked down into the chamber and saw the demon drill. It was immense, not merely large enough to bore through bedrock, but vast enough that bedrock seemed an indignity it endured rather than a challenge. Its forward auger assembly was a spinning crown of teeth the size of chimera hulls, each tooth smeared black with vitrified stone and glistening residues I did not care to name. Behind the cutting head swelled a segmented hull, plated in iron, brass, and dark machine skin stretched tight over mechanisms that moved like musculature beneath it. Conduits fed into its flanks from pumping stations and tether pylons. Furnace mouths along its length exhaled smoke in slow animal breaths. At intervals, the hull pulsed, not with piston rhythm, but with something hideously organic. It throbbed like a heart. Around it, the underhive's stolen industry revolved. Conveyor arteries fed munition crates to side galleries. Labor gangs hauled fresh bracing into subsidiary shafts. Servitors tracked the machine's progress with survey lenses and auger spines. Iron warriors moved among the gantries and maintenance platforms with the calm possession of architects overseeing a grand civic work. It might almost have been admirable if it were not built from everything fit only to disgust God and man alike. Heston stared at the engine and whispered a stream of Binharik profanity so dense I understood only the hatred in it. "That thing is part drill, part furnace, part warp-bound motivator," he said. "It is using sacrificial harmonic pressure to stabilize output. They have cored the machine spirit and replaced obedience with appetite." "Can it die?" I asked. "Everything can die if you cut deeply enough." So we did what men always do in the presence of impossible machinery. We turned to demolition. The chamber's support logic revealed itself slowly. Main load pillars rose behind the engine in staggered intervals. Power relays fed through a spine of armored conduits on the left gantry. Beneath the central bore platform, deeper than any of us wished to think about, lay the motive chamber where pressure, fuel, and whatever warp things kept the monster animate were being driven together into movement. Blow the outer supports, and the chamber might partially fail. Blow the motive cluster, and perhaps the whole understructure would come down on itself. We split up in silence. Malrech and one stormtrooper moved to the upper gantries to watch the nearest Iron Warrior survey team. Serev and I took the left relay spine with 2 melter charges and a satchel of cut-wire detonators. Heston and the remaining engineers crawled toward the main support braces with the primary load, a demolition package so overburdened it took 3 men to shift it quietly. The 3rd stormtrooper covered the rear throat, watching our route, of return like a man who already knew it would not remain one. We placed the first charges without alarm, the second almost as cleanly. The air was so loud with machinery that even a dropped tool might pass unheard. I was arm deep in a conduit recess, sealing the mag clamps against a relay housing, when Serev suddenly seized my wrist hard enough to bruise. Someone had spoken behind us. "Do not," the voice said, "mistake silence for concealment." We turned. The siege captain with the gravhammer stood on the gantry above the relay spine, looking down at us through helm lenses that glowed like furnace coals behind smoked armor glass. He had removed none of his plate despite the heat. Condensation streamed from the edges of his gorget and evaporated in the furnace wind. Around him, 2 Iron Warriors and a knot of gun servitors fanned outward with precise, economical motion. No shouting, no alarm horns, only interception. He dropped from the gantry with the same impossible weight I remembered from Ferrum 9, landing close enough that the deck plates flexed under him. "You are persistent," he said. There was no anger in it, not even satisfaction, merely notation. I rose slowly, laser gun coming up. He tilted his helm a fraction, almost curious. "You mistake survival for defiance. Stone does this too, just before it cracks." Then the chamber erupted. Malrech fired first from the upper gantry. His shotgun blast took one gun servitor through the sensor cluster and sent it cartwheeling into the relay pit. The stormtrooper beside him opened with hellgun bursts across the captain's shoulder plates, bright impacts that scored ceramite and achieved nothing else. I triggered the nearest melter charge and dived as the relay housing turned to white fire. Serev screamed a warning lost in the detonation. The Iron Warrior captain came through the blast haze untouched enough to matter, gravhammer already rising. The weapon struck the gantry rail where I had been a heartbeat earlier and folded plasteel inward with a sound like bone being crushed inside a sealed chest. The distortion wave from the impact hurled me sideways into a conduit bank hard enough to make my vision flash white. All order died in the next seconds. Close quarters in tunnels are never combat as tacticians describe it. They are butchery performed in choking air at arm's reach. The relay spine became a knot of muzzle flashes, sparks, steam, and wet impacts. Serev emptied half a charge pack point blank into a slave handler rushing with a hooked prod, then clubbed another down with the receiver unit hanging from his chest. One stormtrooper was dragged screaming by the ankles beneath a conveyor belt, where turning teeth caught his legs and chewed upward in red increments through thigh, groin, and spine. Malrech leapt from the gantry when the Iron Warriors began climbing after him and hit the deck with his entrenching blade already in hand, burying it in an overseer's, throat to the hinge. I found myself toe-to-toe with an engineer serf in a rebreather hood, both of us too close to aim properly. He came at me with a rivet gun. I drove my knife under the hood seam and felt the face behind it collapse around the blade. When I tore it free, something hot and arterial hit my cheek. The siege captain moved through us like a tool built to demonstrate futility. He did not swing wild. He did not bellow invocations. He selected men and ended them. A stormtrooper tried to flank him with a melter bomb, and the gravhammer came across once, not even a full strike, just enough to implode the man's ribcage inward in a spray of blood and armor shards. Another sapper lunged with a breaching pick and lost both legs to a bolt burst before the point landed. The captain stepped over the lower half of him without pause. "Left vent!" Heston's voice shrieked over the din. "Drive them into the steam vent!" I saw what he meant. A maintenance artery to my right was already glowing along its seams, pressure building behind cracked hazard plates. I shot the lock wheel. Serev, Emperor help him, understood at once and threw himself against the release lever while a slave ganger hacked at his back with a broken shovel. The vent door blew open. Scalding steam roared into the passage, white and dense and full of shrieking metal fragments. Flesh came off faces in strips. One iron warrior staggered for the first time, one armored gauntlet snapping up to protect his lenses as the superheated blast struck. I seized the moment, fired the second melter charge manually, and the left relay spine vanished in a cone of incandescent ruin that tore support beams free and dropped half the gantry into the chamber below. The demon drill screamed. It was not a machine noise then, not wholly. Something inside the engine felt the damage and answered with a howl so full of rage and hunger that every labourer in sight dropped to his knees or tried to claw, his own ears off. Across the chamber, Heston had reached the primary support cluster. I saw him through smoke and steam, a small robed figure beside the towering bulk of the engine. Mechadendrites spread, one arm buried up to the elbow in the detonation housing as he fought damage controls and machine resistance alike. Around him, the central chamber shook. Support braces failed in sequence. Conveyor arteries buckled. Stone rained from the roof. The demon drill thrashed against its tether pylons with a force that made entire sections of the underwork scream in protest. "Withdraw!" I shouted. "Heston now!" He turned his head toward us. Half his remaining flesh face was burned. One mechadendrite had been torn away. Yet his organic eye was perfectly calm. "No," he said. He slapped the manual rune. The primary charge went up inside the motive chamber. The world beneath Helicon became light, pressure, and falling stone. I do not remember the first seconds clearly, only fragments. The sound of the blast deeper than hearing, as if some giant hand had clapped over the entire underhive. The demon drill convulsing as its hull split along glowing seams. A rain of steel teeth. A support pylon toppling through a labour gang and reducing 50 men to meet under one descending slab. The central floor shearing open to reveal furnace glow and things moving in it that should never have seen air. Heston vanished in the heart of that brilliance, not consumed so much as incorporated into the detonation he had chosen. A martyrdom of iron and function, exactly as he would have named it. Half the tunnel complex began to come down. Serev and I ran because instinct is older than honor. Malrech was with us for perhaps 6 strides more, and then a collapsing conveyor bridge took him sideways into a rubble wash, and I never saw him again. Only the brief flare of a shot in the dust before the passage folded shut. Behind us, the underworks died by degrees and violence. Steam pipes burst, ammo crates cooked off, buried labourers screamed under slabs of rockcrete and riveted steel. The demon engine's final howls echoed through every shaft, like the death cries of a god too crude to deserve the name. We fled through collapsing maintenance arteries, over broken gratings slick with oil and blood, beneath cables dropping live fire into the dark. Once, Serev slipped on a wash of machine grease and nearly went into a conveyor moor, jammed with body parts and shattered cogs. I caught his harness and tore him back so hard the strap nearly strangled him. Another time, a chain gang, driven mad by the collapse, stampeded through a side gallery and trampled one of the surviving stormtroopers flat against a bulkhead before vanishing into steam. At last, we saw light ahead. Not daylight, not safety, just the lurid red-orange flicker of open fire and emergency lumens from a larger chamber beyond the final shaft. We stumbled toward it through a crack in a collapsed, retaining wall and emerged coughing into what should have been one of Helicon's lower transit transfer halls. It was not Helicon anymore. The hall had been fortified. Riveted iron barricades crossed the main approach. Sandbag walls of shredded fibre and corpse fill lined the old platform edges. Heavy bolter nests were emplaced where ticket gantries had once stood. Ammo pallets were stacked beneath defaced station saints. Pressure doors had been recoded and welded into choke points. Vox masts rose from the concourse floor. Slave gangs and mortal auxilia hauled shells along tracks where civilian transports had run before the siege. At the far end of the hall, through a breach hammered into an adjoining wall, I saw a second trench line dug straight through the interior of the city, complete with revetments, wire and kill lanes marked in white chalk across the floor. Iron warriors had built a forward redoubt inside the hive. One of the legionaries on the inner parapet turned as we emerged from the rubble. For a heartbeat, he and I simply looked at one another across 20 meters of smoke and dying light. Then he raised a hand and pointed, not in surprise, but in simple acknowledgement that two surviving problems had revealed themselves. Serev made a sound very like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "We are not escaping," he whispered. No, that was the final obscenity waiting beneath the city. We were no longer defenders pressed from outside, no longer merely a garrison holding walls against a siege line in the ash beyond. The enemy had already passed beneath our skin. They had dug, fortified, measured and armed a second front within the hive itself. Helicon was no longer a fortress under assault. It was a fortress with another fortress growing inside it, iron set within flesh, the besiegers' geometry now hammered into our own foundations. By the time the first shots reached for us across that transit hall, I understood that there was nowhere left in the city that the siege had not already entered. Serev and I survived the transit hall only because the first volley meant for us struck the rubble where we had stood a heartbeat earlier and buried the firing angle in dust. The Iron Warriors' redoubt inside the hive opened on us with all the same measured economy they had shown beyond the walls. Heavy bolter rounds tore the broken retaining edge to splinters. Lasfire and stubber tracers crossed the old concourse in disciplined bands, each lane chosen not merely to kill, but to herd. We ran because every line of fire behind us had already been marked, and every second spent understanding the shape of the trap would only complete it. That was how the hive felt now. Not occupied, partitioned. The enemy no longer needed to think in terms of front and rear. They had two fronts inside Helicon, one pressing inward from the breach and another rising from the under foundations. And between them, the surviving districts had become an arrangement of kill boxes, starvation cells and transit mazes, in which the defenders were driven from one prepared cruelty into the next. Doors that had once meant refuge now sealed whole populations into sectors the enemy shelled by schedule. Corridors that looked empty turned out to be pre-ranged execution channels. Shelter blocks were isolated, cut off from water, then left long enough to weaken before breacher columns arrived. A besieged city still imagines it has an inside. The Iron Warriors had taken even that concept from us. Serev and I escaped through a vent artery where steam and old machine oil had coated the walls so thickly a man could leave handprints in the black. We came out 2 levels lower into one of the freight sinks behind the southern transit sectors, where what remained of Helicon's defenders were trying to stitch a battle line out of reserve companies, penal remnants, shrine guards, and men so exhausted they fired by command reflex more than thought. Nobody had time to ask where Heston was. Nobody needed the answer spoken. Captain Oren Thass still lived then, though the siege had pared him down to something harder and quieter. He met us in the shadow of an overturned rail hauler, whose cargo bed had been turned into a command lectern, and listened while I told him what lay beneath the city. "A redoubt," he said. "Yes, Captain. Subsurface trenches? Yes. Guns? Yes." He nodded once, as if ticking off expected defects in a machine component. "Then the hive is divided." "It is caged," I said. His expression did not change. Same result. The word remained with me afterward. Caged. It was the right one. Not for me alone, not for soldiers alone, but for all of Helicon. Every surviving district was now a compartment in an enormous iron trap whose bars were made of walls, shelling patterns, poisoned water, and simple need. Men still spoke of counterattacks in some sectors. Priests still called for resistance. Quartermasters still moved ration ledgers from one table to another. Yet beneath all the forms of continuity, there was a newer truth. The city no longer belonged to itself. The Iron Warriors used the population as part of the cage. I saw it first from a shattered hab bridge overlooking the old mercantile sinks of the mid-hive. A breacher column was advancing through a collapsed avenue, mobile mantlets at the rear, legionaries behind them, traitor auxilia spread on the flanks. Ahead of that line came civilians, thousands of them, driven in tight groups by shock prods, gunfire and loudhailer commands. They stumbled through rubble, over corpses and wrecked hab carts, hands raised or clasped behind their heads, because they had learned too late that posture did not matter. Whenever one of them triggered a mine, the column behind simply adjusted its route. Whenever defenders fired from cover, the return fire from the Iron Warriors followed instantly, now guided by the dying. The civilians were mine clearers, range markers and morale weapons all at once. One woman carrying a child took 3 steps into the avenue and vanished in a spray of stone and blood as a buried charge detonated beneath her. The men behind her recoiled. The whip teams drove them forward over what remained. Jorek would have cursed until his stitches burst at that sight. Hestin would have named the tactic efficient with a hatred that made the word a prayer. I only watched, too empty for outrage, and too alive to pretend that I had not learned the enemy's habits by then. Do not waste shells on the dying. Spend flesh to buy data. Pressure reveals confession. The city was teaching their language to all of us. We moved position through sectors already transformed beyond recognition. Cathedrals had been turned into ammunition depots, where shell stacks rose in the shadows of defaced saints. Devotional candles replaced by range lamps and powder manifests. Manufactoria became execution halls, their loading bays repurposed for sorting prisoners into labor cadres, death quotas and fuel vats. The Iron Warriors treated sacred and profane with the same utilitarian contempt, because to them, utility was sacred enough. A reliquary arch was good for suspending chains. An altar stone made a fine map table. A saint's plinth, once the figure had been dragged down and smashed, became an excellent mount for a heavy weapon. Every place in Helicon now had a use other than the one for which it had been built. Some of those uses were worse than battle. In the lower forge districts, where the enemy's inner redoubts linked to captured supply arteries, I saw slave forges at work. The dead were stripped on conveyor lines by collared labourers moving with the dulled speed of men long past horror. Cloth and armour scraps went to one chute, bone to another, flesh to grinders and rendering troughs where industrial heat and chem additives turned it into slurry. The output was decanted according to need. Protein ration stock for slave gangs and militia, fibrous filler for sandbags, grease and rendered fats for burners and low-grade industrial fuel. Nothing was wasted. I watched a row of bodies from one of our own reserve companies pass under hooked cutting arms, boots already removed, identification tags gone, and understood that even after death, Helicon's defenders would still be made to hold the line, only in forms more obedient than flesh. Serev saw those forges too. He had become quieter since the tunnel collapse. Quieter even than the old Cull, who had always conserved his words the way misers conserve coin. At first, I thought grief had finally hollowed him. Then, in a sheltered pump alcove, while we waited for a shell pattern to pass, he began to speak in a low, unbroken murmur without looking at me. "I hear them in my sleep," he said. "The forges? The guns." I said nothing. When exhausted men begin to confess in a siege, interruption can break the only honesty left in them. He rubbed at his face with shaking fingers. The bombardment, the intervals, the way they rotate from sanctum to sanctum. I hear it before it comes now. Not every shell. The pattern, like verses. He swallowed and looked at the floor. Like hymns. Emperor, forgive me, Lucan. I wake before impact because I know the next line. Because you have been listening too long. No. He shook his head, slow and miserable. Because they meant us to learn it. The whole city. We live by their rhythm now. We flinch when they tell us to. We lie down when they allow silence. I hear their artillery like liturgy. He finally looked at me then, and what terrified me was not madness, but recognition. He knew what was happening to him. The cage had got inside his hearing. Before I could answer, the command net snapped with a fresh crisis. A reserve company from the eastern transit sanctums had been boxed in behind collapsed gates in Sector Gethsemar, cut off between a forward push from the breach side and a subterranean incursion erupting through a magrail vault. They were holding, barely, in a pressure corridor with civilians trapped behind them and ammunition nearly spent. Captain Thass ordered a strike force to cut them free or at least reopen a route for evacuation toward the final sanctum. I took the order because there were still things a sapper might do in a city of broken doors. The force I got was what Helicon could spare. A handful of trench survivors, 2 enforcers, Serev, and a squad of shrine guards whose ceremonial armor had become little more than shrapnel traps. Commissar Skane joined us without announcement, appearing at the head of the column as if darkness itself had decided to take the shape of a man in a black coat and cap. "Try not to waste my time, Sergeant," he said. "That depends on the enemy," I replied. "No, it depends on you." We reached Sector Gethsemar, through feeder ducts and maintenance stairs, so packed with shelter overflow that we had to climb over the sleeping and the dying alike. At the final gate throat, we found the reserve company exactly where the reports had placed them. Jammed behind half-collapsed transit doors, firing through a gap the width of a cargo trolley, while the enemy pressed from both ends of the corridor. The air was thick with promethium smoke, pulverized stone, and the reek of opened bodies. Men were killing one another at such close distance that firearms had become secondary instruments. The first thing I saw through the gap was a guardsman using the sharpened edge of a ration tin to saw at a traitor militiaman's throat, while the 2 rolled in slurry under a flickering lumen strip. The second was an auxiliary gunner beating a wounded shrine guard with a broken auspex rod until the man's skull came apart in pieces. Bayonets were too long for some of the crush points. Knives, fists, teeth, and snapped. Machinery edges did the rest. We forced the gate. Not cleanly. Nothing was clean anymore. Sapper charges blew the jammed lock teeth. The blast peeled one of the doors back just enough for Brack to have walked through had Brack still lived. We went in at a run instead, shoulder to shoulder, shooting where there was room and hacking where there was not. Corridor fighting is an intimacy I would wish only on traitors. There is no heroic measure to it, no stance, no battlefield grandeur. Only breath in the face, blood on the knuckles, metal walls close enough to throw the sound back into your skull until you do not know whether the ringing in your ears is gunfire or fear. I put my bayonet through the mouth of a militia overseer and felt his teeth grind along the blade as he died. An enforcer beside me lost his sidearm and bit into a cultist's cheek hard enough to tear flesh free before driving the man's own knife into his eye. Serev struck one foe 3 times in the temple with the butt of his compact receiver until the casing split and wiring spilled out like viscera. We freed the boxed company by degrees. Every meter had to be killed for. Every civilian dragged back from the rear crush became another obstacle when panic surged. Somewhere behind us, Scanner's bolt pistol boomed at intervals too deliberate to be random. I knew without turning that some of those shots were meant for our enemies, and some for our own men trying to break. At the corridor mouth beyond the transit gates, the enemy line suddenly thinned, not because we had broken it, because it had been told to part. A Vox burst crackled in clipped Binharik, and the traitor militia drew back with all the fearful obedience of curs scenting their master's approach. Through the smoke and emergency haze, up on a command balcony overlooking the sector junction, I saw him. Warsmith Vorak Drell. No Pict I had seen before the siege had done justice to the physical insult of his presence. He was not, merely larger than the men around him. He seemed denser, as if his armor and the will inside it obeyed harsher laws of weight than ordinary matter. Gunmetal plates layered over one another with fortress logic. Hazard stripes dulled by ash. Cloak remnants hanging like scorched banners from one shoulder. Around him stood his chosen killers and signal adepts, all arranged with the same economy as artillery pieces emplaced on a field of fire. He looked down at us as a siege engineer might look down at cracks spreading through a wall he had already doomed. I raised my lasgun. He saw me do it. For one impossible instant, I believed I mattered. that perhaps I had cut deep enough into his plans, survived enough of his works, that he might recognize me as an enemy worthy of his personal attention. Such hopes are a vanity peculiar to men trapped inside great wars. We want our suffering to be seen by the one inflicting it. Vorak did not even reach for a weapon. He studied the corridor, the broken gate, the battered reserve companies spilling back toward us, the civilians crushed in the rear press, the dead already packing the floor, and then his gaze settled on me as one might settle it on a tool left inconveniently in the wrong place. "This hive fell," he said, and though he did not shout, I heard him clearly over battle noise. The day it mistook walls for strength. That was all. Not threat, not triumph, not hatred. A judgment so complete it had no need of emphasis. Then he turned slightly and gestured to someone beyond my line of sight. The enemy line resumed fire at once, not because he had demanded blood in theatrical fashion, but because whatever assessment had occupied him was complete and killing could continue. I survived only because I was beneath notice. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it wounded more deeply than any physical strike could have. A man can endure being hated. He can even endure being hunted. To stand before the architect of your city's death and discover yourself too insignificant to waste a shell on is another kind of lesson entirely. We withdrew with the reserve company under covering fire from our last serviceable heavy stubber and a demolition collapse that brought half the junction roof down between us and the pursuing militia. Not all the civilians made it through. Not all the reserve company wanted to leave after what they had seen beyond the gate. One lieutenant had to be dragged bodily from the threshold because he kept trying to count his men aloud, as if arithmetic might resurrect them. Skane struck him once with the grip of the bolt pistol, and the counting stopped. By then, the final fallback had begun. Orders rippled across what remained of Helicon's loyal defense network in grim converging lines. All surviving forces, all command cadres, all functioning Medicae, all remaining ration stores and reactor crews were to withdraw to the final sanctum around the reactor cathedral at the hive's core. The outer sanctums were no longer tenable. The mid-hive transit belts were compromised. The under foundations had become enemy territory in all but name. There remained one redoubt large enough, powered enough, and symbolically central enough to gather the ruin of the city into one last refusal. We moved with the flood. Millions of civilians were already pressing toward the sanctum by then, a human migration inside a dying machine. Families dragged carts made from shell crates. Priests carried reliquaries and fuel canisters with equal reverence. Tech adepts pushed humming generator wagons through crowds so dense the wheels climbed over feet, and the owners could not even cry out. Command staff rode in damaged carriers ringed by the last disciplined troops. Above us, the shelling still moved by calculated pattern. Ahead of us, the reactor cathedral glowed through smoke and steam with the distant radiance of something half holy, half industrial, all necessity. I looked back once from an upper feeder ramp. The hive behind us was broken into zones of fire, darkness, and methodical enemy occupation. Somewhere in that ruin, Malrech had been taken. We learned the truth of it from a hijacked loudhailer as we moved. The enemy had nailed him to the side of a hab tower as a speaking relic, kept alive by pumps and clamps just long enough for his own prayers to be broadcast over their artillery. His voice came to us in fragments through static and shell thunder, still trying to summon endurance from a city that had almost none left to summon. The words drowned. The guns did not. By the time we reached the last security cordon before the final sanctum, every surviving road in Helicon seemed to be pouring human misery toward the same blazing heart. There, around the reactor cathedral that powered the hive, millions were already crammed shoulder to shoulder beneath vaults of iron and stained glass, while the last command staff of a dead city prepared to decide how much of it they could still deny the enemy. The cage had narrowed to its final compartment. Captain Orenthas died before the final order was spoken, which was fitting in a way too cruel for any priest to call providence. He took the hit in the outer ring of the sanctum while trying to reposition the last reserve guns across a processional way already choked with civilians and shell-blinded militia. A breacher round came through the western stained glass, punched through the shrine balustrade behind him, and turned half his torso into red ruin and broken officer's braid. He stayed standing for perhaps 2 heartbeats after that, long enough to shout for the crews to keep the guns traversing inward, long enough to remain Captain Thas by force of hatred alone. And then he folded over the map lectern with both hands, still braced on the edge, as if refusing to fall had simply become impossible to sustain. No speech marked his death, no moment of reverence. Men dragged his body aside to clear the line of fire, and another officer tried to take command, only to lose his head to a sniper round before he reached the lectern. The chain above me collapsed in less than a minute. That had become the nature of Helicon's final hours. Not heroic, last stands arranged for memory, but constant amputation of command until whoever still breathed and could hear an order became the next rung by default. By then, Commissar Holt Skane was nearly blind. A shell burst in the lower transept had driven stained glass, brass, and powdered stone into the left side of his face. One eye was a red ruin. The other remained open by an act of discipline so severe it felt unnatural to witness. Blood ran constantly from beneath the brim of his cap, down his cheek, and into the collar of his coat, but he still moved through the reactor cathedral with bolt pistol in one hand and a bandolier of grenades slung across his chest like a sacramental chain. Confessor Malrech had not died on the Hab Tower, as the enemy intended. They had taken him down only when his body was too ruined to remain useful as spectacle and too stubborn to stop speaking. Somehow, through means I never learned, loyalists had brought him back into the sanctum half-nailed to a slab of broken cladding, his chest punctured by support rods, one arm ruined beyond saving, his voice reduced to a blood-thick whisper that still somehow carried farther than healthier men could manage. They propped him beside the inner reactor chapel because there was nowhere else left for holy things but at the core. It was in that state that the last command conclave decided to kill the hive. The reactor cathedral sat at Helicon's heart like a union between faith and machinery that only the Imperium would ever find natural. The nave rose over the primary plasma chambers in tiered vaults of iron and stained glass, every arch thick with cog motifs, saints, service litanies, and the old carved declarations that labor was praise and energy, a sacrament. Below the floor ran the cathedral's true soul: cooling arteries, pressure regulators, motive exchangers, loading rams, dampening chambers, and the ancient overload systems no one was ever meant to touch outside the final article of denial. The enemy wanted it intact. If they took the reactor cathedral, they would own not only power, but legitimacy. The beating heart of Helicon would become their redoubt, their foundry, their engine for every further siege in the sector. Men understood that even through hunger, terror, and shell shock. So the final decision, once spoken, spread through the sanctum with the dead calm of absolute necessity. Overload the reactor. Deny the prize. Burn everything still alive inside, if that was the cost. I was given the order because everyone above me was broken, dead, or no longer mobile enough to carry it. The senior engine seers had either been buried in the western collapse or torn apart defending the lower. Regulators. Thas lay cooling beneath a tarp, dark with his own blood. The next ranking line officer had no legs. Scan could barely see and could not be spared from holding discipline at the inner cordons. Heston Row was ash somewhere below the foundations. Serev still had his vox. I still had my feet. In the Imperium, that is often enough to become important for all the wrong reasons. A half-burned data slate was thrust into my hands by a reactor adept whose skin had been blistered from one side by steam. Manual route, he croaked. Primary console codes voided. Carry to overload chamber. Trigger the old sequence if machine spirit compliance fails. I looked down at the slate. So much of the script had been seared away that it seemed less an order than a curse. Skane gripped my shoulder hard enough to bruise through the flak. "You go to the heart," he said. His ruined eye wept blood. "You do not ask whether there is enough left to save. There is not." Understood. Good. He turned his head slightly, listening to the battle deepening through the nave, then stopped behaving like a man who still hopes for permission. The sanctum battle had become apocalypse by then. Tanks fought in the nave aisles between toppled pews and burning incense engines, their tracks grinding bone, brass and prayer books together into slick metallic paste. One Lehman Russ from the last armor reserve fired point blank into a breacher tank coming through the west transept and blew both vehicles apart so violently that molten armor and human fragments rained down from the choir vaults. Servitors burned where they stood in devotional rows, incense spilling from their censers as promethium ate through robe cloth and exposed augmetics alike. The stained glass above had begun to liquefy from heat and repeated shock, pouring down the columns in glowing colors that hardened into razor ridges across the floor or splashed onto the wounded, branding saints into their flesh. The paving stones underfoot were slick with blood, oil and molten brass. You could smell all three separately if you had been born to war. The blood was bright and hot, the oil bitter and mechanical. The brass carried that strange cooked sweetness metal acquires when it has passed too near a furnace. Men slipped on it while firing. Men drowned in it where the floor had become a low basin of runoff and opened bodies. A shrine guard beside me took a round through the throat, fell backward into a pool of brass spilled from a shattered reliquary frame, and died making no sound at all because his lungs had nowhere left to pull air from. Then the Terminators came. There is a quality to teleport strike that no veteran ever mistakes after first exposure. The air thickens. Static raises every hair on the body. Lumen strips gutter blue. The machine systems nearest the event begin screaming warnings too late to matter. Then reality opens in a burst of eye-searing. Light and transhuman mass arrives inside whatever line thought itself secure. The Iron Warriors Terminators materialized in the North Choir with combi weapons already firing. The first burst turned a heavy bolter team into meat slapping the organ pipes. The second ripped through a cluster of reactor adepts, trying to haul coolant hoses into position. One of the Terminators carried a chain fist larger than a man's torso and drove it into a support pillar with methodical intent, not seeking blood first, but structure. They had come not for theatrics, but to break the cathedral's internal geometry while the outer assault pressed. Above them, in the collapsed choir lofts, Havocs had already found firing positions among shattered statuary and hanging lengths of liquefied lead. Their autocannons and missile launchers raked the nave with murderous discipline, each burst chosen to pin, break, or isolate rather than merely slaughter. The cult infantry flooded the lower galleries beneath them, screaming prayers to dark powers, to iron, to blood, to anything that had not yet abandoned them. Some wore worker harnesses over flak. Some carried tools instead of proper weapons. Enough of them reached the pew lines that knives, clubs, and bayonets again replaced clean battle distance. Serevkul redeemed himself there. He planted his Vox unit beneath the shattered base of a saint and turned the whole nave into a map in his mind. Relay to transept teams. Call corrections to the last functioning demolition crews. Redirect fallback routes when one aisle became a furnace and another a kill lane. He spoke until his voice broke, then kept speaking through blood and static alike, forcing order through channels the enemy kept trying to poison. South Ambulatory, close your seal now. No, now. Terminator incursion in the upper gallery. Demolition Team 3, your route is gone. Cut through the reliquary crypt. Inner cordon. Keep the west nave open for overload runner. Keep it open. A burst of shrapnel from a missile impact tore through the St. Plinth above him and opened his abdomen from hip to navel. He sagged sideways, one hand instinctively trying to hold himself in. The other stayed on the Vox controls. I knelt to pull him back. He shoved me away with more strength than he should have had. Move, he hissed. You are the order now. I left him there because the whole cathedral had become a place where friendship was a slower form of betrayal than obedience. Malrech died at the reactor console. He had dragged himself there with whatever remained of his hands and knees while the alarms rose around him, a broken confessor hauling his own impaled body through blood and sacred oil toward the nearest place in the cathedral, where faith and mechanism still touched directly. When I passed the inner chapel threshold, I saw him bent over the aquila of the control plinth, forehead resting against the brass eagle, his blind side leaking down the wings. He was praying, though prayer had become nearly indistinguishable from coughing. "Golden throne," he rasped, blood stringing between his teeth and the aquila. "Witness, witness these sons, witness that they did not kneel." The alarms shrieked. Somewhere behind us a tank detonated inside the nave. The floor shook. Malrech coughed again and red sprayed across the eagle's breast. "Witness," he whispered once more, and then his weight went fully forward and he lay still over the console, dead not in peace, but in refusal. I had no time to close his eyes. One still had none left to close. The route to the overload chamber ran below the main sanctuary through service aisles, loading passages and reactor maintenance arteries so old their warning runes had been carved rather than stamped. 2 demolition troopers joined me for the first stretch. One died to a frag burst in a junction where the walls blew inward and reduced him to a smear across the pressure door. The other made it as far as the coolant descent before a bolt round punched through his helmet and dropped him into the shaft. After that, I went alone with the half-burned slate and the knowledge that every remaining second was being purchased by men dying elsewhere in the cathedral. I reached the overload chamber and discovered the enemy had expected us. The room should have been a sanctuary of old machine authority, all brass wheels, regulator shrines, and massive insulated control trunks feeding into the reactor's denial systems. Much of that remained. What had been added was worse. Dampening fields had been erected around the primary vent housings, their emitters bolted directly into the chamber walls, with fresh iron braces and cables, still wet with machine grease. Sacrificial machine wards hung from the key manifolds, cages of bone, copper and bound circuitry in which flayed bodies twitched as current ran through them, bleeding their deaths into the system in a rhythm designed to absorb overload spikes and contain sympathetic collapse. The Iron Warriors had anticipated the last Imperial reflex and built an answer inside our heart. For one frozen instant, I simply stared. Not because it was impossible. By then, nothing the enemy did seemed beyond their reach. I stared because the final refuge of thought, the comforting notion that there must remain some sacred place inside the city, where desperation still held initiative, died there between those humming dampers and twitching machine wards. Then I heard the heavy tread behind me and knew the siege captain had come to finish the lesson personally. He entered through the service arch with the same cold certainty I remembered from below and from Ferrum 9. Gravhammer held low, armor scored and blackened by the cathedral battle, but still impossibly whole compared with the men he had crossed to get here. His helm optics settled on me. No triumph, no anger, the simple recognition of a surviving obstruction. "You continue," he said. "So do you." "That is because my work is not yet complete." He advanced. I fired first. Last bolts flared across his cuirass and did nothing worth noticing. He came on through them and swung the gravhammer in a low arc, meant to break my legs and end the fight in one efficient stroke. I threw myself backward over a loading rail, felt the distortion waves snap the metal conduit beside my hip like brittle bone, and rolled with the impact as sparks showered down. I could not kill him by soldiers' means. That truth was clear before my boots found purchase again. So I fought him as a sapper. The overload chamber was built around old reactor loading machinery. Among it, a massive hydraulic ram once used to seep pressure casks into the inner exchange housings. The ram ran on recessed tracks through the chamber floor and ended in a locking carriage of brass-jawed clamps large enough to hold a vehicle-sized load steady during transfer. Under battle, under conditions it had become just another piece of scenery. Under desperation, it became a weapon. I ran for it. The captain understood too late what I intended. He fired once, the bolt shell skimming my shoulder and taking flesh away in a wet spray that turned my whole arm numb. I slammed into the ram controls, hit the emergency wake rune, and the ancient machine answered with a roar of awakening hydraulics. He was on me then. The first backhand from the gravhammer's haft spun me sideways hard enough to split my lip against my own teeth. The second strike I barely caught on the chamber rail, and the field shock running through the blow made half my body go dead for a heartbeat. He reached for my throat with his free gauntlet, perhaps to hold me still while he pulped my skull on the next swing. I let him take me. That is the only reason I lived. I stumbled deliberately into the open loading carriage and grabbed the inner clamp brace as if from blind panic. He stepped in after me, to finish it. All weight and contempt, one arm pinning me against the brass jaws. Up close he smelled not like corruption or demon musk, but oil, hot ceramite, and the dry metallic scent of old workshop dust. Even his nearness was industrial. "You are already broken," he said. I spat blood into the grill of his helm and hit the lock rune behind my back. The carriage clamps snapped shut. Even for a transhuman warplate frame, the hydraulic jaws were not built to be occupied. They were built to crush tolerances flat, to hold impossible pressure vessels immobile against industrial force. Brass and adamant teeth slammed inward on both of us. My left side vanished into agony. Something in my ribs gave. The captain tried to wrench free, but the gravhammer was trapped awkwardly across his torso, and the first clamp had already bitten into his pauldron and breastplate. I hit the pressure cycle. The loading ram engaged. There are sounds flesh makes under industrial force that no battlefield prepares a man to hear. His armor shrieked first, field coils in the gravhammer overloading as the weapon twisted between clamp and chest. Then ceramite cracked. Then what lay under the ceramite began to compress. Not explode, not tear, compress. Bone failing inward, organs forced against armored plate. A transhuman body reduced to the same mechanical truth every siege engine eventually teaches to stone. He did not scream long. One red lens burst. Dark blood and something thicker blew from the grill. The gravhammer head sheared off and dropped to the chamber floor with enough weight to crater it. I triggered the cycle again until the loading ram had no more room to give, and the thing that had been the siege captain was a crushed mass of armor, flesh and leaking pressure locked in the jaws beside me. I tore myself free from the carriage half mangled, leaving skin and cloth where the clamps had trapped me, and crawled to the overloaded console. The dampening fields still hummed. The sacrificial wards still bled current. The enemy's preparations had not made denial impossible. They had made it incomplete. My hands shook so badly I had to key the first override rune 3 times before the console accepted it. The half-burned slate spat rejection code and emergency liturgy alike. I bypassed what I could, cut what I could not. The old reactor machine spirit resisted, perhaps confused by the wards, perhaps by the sheer volume of contradictory authority forced into its heart. Warning glyphs cascaded across the display. Pressure rose. Containment prayers failed. Not full failure. Not enough. Then Scanner's voice came over the local channel, ragged with blood and static. "Voss, I am here." "Good." He coughed. I heard firing behind him, close and continuous. "I have the lower breach. You need to pull back." "No." A pause. "Listen carefully." The chamber trembled as breaches hit the outer service seals. I could hear them now, the hammering on the doors, the shouted code bursts, the disciplined urgency of men about to take the last room that mattered. "The city is dead," Skane said. "Stop trying to save what is already dead." Then his channel opened to cathedral noise, and I heard him shout not at me, but at the breaches reaching his position. "For the Emperor!" he roared, and detonated the grenades on his chest. The blast came through the service arches as a wall of pressure, heat, and pulverized stone. The overload chamber doors bowed inward. One tore off its track and slammed down in a sheet of sparks. Skane had bought the seconds he promised, and no more. I triggered the sequence. The reactor answered with a howl that rose through every chamber of the sanctum. Pressure caskets blew. Steam and plasma bled through vent seams. The great stained glass vaults above the cathedral flashed white from within, as if dawn itself had ignited inside the city. Yet the dampening fields bit down, and the sacrificial wards drank part of the surge, containing what should have become total annihilation into something lesser and therefore, in some ways, crueler. The partial overload ripped the cathedral district apart. The nave collapsed inward. Choir lofts and transepts folded into the reactor wells. Tens of thousands died at once. Defenders, civilians, slaves, breachers, all buried under sanctified iron, molten brass, blast pressure, and falling stone. Fire rolled through the sanctum arteries. Inner galleries vanished. The lower crypts became steam tombs. The heart of Helicon tore itself open and buried a continent of prayer under rubble. But the hive did not die. Even as the chamber threw me backward into darkness and falling debris, even as the world became heat and ruin and the last cathedral bells screamed themselves apart, I knew it. The blast was too contained, too local, crippling, yes, devastating, enough to shatter the district, to deny the reactor cathedral, as a prize in its intended form. Not enough to vaporize the whole hive. Not enough to stop the city from falling piece by piece under the enemy's patient hand. I had broken the heart. The body still lived long enough to be taken. I woke beneath a church that no longer believed in itself. For a long while, I could not tell whether I had survived the overload or merely delayed understanding that I was dead. The world around me was pressure, buried heat, and a red dark full of settling noises. Stone cracked somewhere above in tired, thoughtful snaps. Steam hissed through fractured conduits. From farther off came the low thunder of secondary collapses moving through Helicon district by district. Not one glorious end, but a patient unbuilding. A void breach somewhere in the upper hive must have opened to the poisoned sky, because every so often a long inward howl passed through the broken ducts, like the city drawing breath through punctured lungs. I tried to move and pain made the attempt into prayer. My left side was one bruise from shoulder to hip, the flesh cross-hatched by clamp bites and shrapnel cuts. Something in my ribs shifted wrong when I rolled. My laser gun was gone. My knife remained because it had lodged beneath me during the blast and cut a trench along my thigh when I dragged myself free. The overload chamber had collapsed into a sloping ruin of brass housings, fallen masonry, and dead machinery. The crushed remains of the siege captain were nowhere visible. Either the blast had buried him deeper or reduced him to the same anonymous paste as the men he had spent so carefully. I crawled. It was all the movement left to me. I dragged myself over broken vent grills and collapsed conduits slick with coolant and blood. Through service throats where dead adepts lay packed against pressure doors in postures of work interrupted. Above me, Helicon continued to die. Not swiftly. That would have been a mercy. It died in sections. A sanctum fire taking a whole housing block with it. Poison leaks spreading through lower shelters and killing those too weak to flee. Clearance actions moving from district to district where the enemy rooted out resistance with bolter fire, promethium, and measured demolition. The partial overload had broken the reactor cathedral, crippled the heart, buried tens of thousands, and torn open half the central sanctum. It had not ended the city. It had only removed the last illusion that any part of it still belonged to us. When I emerged into the transit ruins above the sanctum, Helicon no longer felt built for human use. The old concourses had been split apart by collapse and fire. Rail lines hung from broken mountings like exposed nerves. Shrines lay flattened under shell slabs. Mountains of dead blocked whole corridors, not in the poetic sense officers like to use after battle, but in actual mounded heaps high enough that men had to climb them or cut around them. Skinless labor gangs lay where furnace. Flashes had stripped them to wet red muscle. Ruptured servitors sprawled open beneath the rubble with their wiring coiled out like pale intestines. A statue of St. Drusus, once 20 meters high, had fallen face first across a platform and cracked through the middle, so that pilgrims now crawled over his broken spine to get from one side to the other. The survivors still moving among that ruin did so under compulsion. Iron Warriors patrols were already sorting the living from the almost living. Auxilia, with tally slates and shock staves, dragged men from under debris and forced them into files. Wounded who could stand were beaten upright and sent one way. Wounded who could not were stacked separately. Children were counted. Priests were separated. Anyone wearing technical augmetics or a mechanicus collar mark was pulled from the general mass and tagged by iron-masked handlers. There were no victory cries, no berserk revels, no drunken rites around the dead. The enemy had taken the heart of the hive and begun immediately to inventory the corpse. That was the final truth of them, the one even fear had not fully taught me until then. The Iron Warriors did not celebrate conquest. They processed it. I lay in the lee of a broken loader track and watched them rebuild Helicon while it still burned. Gun crews emplaced fresh artillery in the shell of our sanctums. Breached doors were reinforced. Rubble was cleared not for mercy, but for traffic flow. New trenches were dug across the very plazas where pilgrims had once queued. Slave gangs were assigned to work details before the blood on the paving had dried. Dead vehicles were stripped for plates and motive parts. Captured ammunition was tallied and redistributed by caliber. Even the blast zone around the reactor cathedral had become a work site. Surveyors marked safe routes. Warpsmith thralls examined surviving power arteries. Mantlets and barricades were rolled into place. The hive was already changing allegiance at the structural level. At one shattered processional square, I saw Warsmith Vorak Drael himself. He stood on the upper balcony of a collapsed administratum frontage, surrounded by signal adepts, legionaries and mortal overseers clutching slate bundles to their chests. Smoke drifted around him. The orange-black glare of the dying sanctum painted one side of his armor in furnace light, while the other remained cold as iron in shadow. Below, tens of thousands of surviving civilians and captured defenders had been herded into holding lanes marked by wire, corpses, and gun servitors. Vorak did not shout. He issued the city's future in the same tone a quartermaster might use for warehouse assignment. Sort by function, he said. Usable workers to the lower forge musters, technical assets to assessment and restraint, breeding stock to secured containment, execution stock to immediate clearance, wall labour to the western lines. No cheer answered him. None was required. The II overseers simply bowed their heads, turned, and began reducing lives into those categories: usable workers, technical assets, breeding stock, execution stock, wall labour. That was all Helicon had become. Not a city, not a population. Inputs. I might have died there watching, had the slave sweep not reached my quarter of the ruins sooner than I expected. Auxilia prodders moved through the wreckage with hooked poles, finding the living by groans, movement, or simple guesswork. Those they wanted were dragged to their feet. Those they did not were marked for later corpse details. I slid backward into a shadowed maintenance cut, trying not to breathe too loudly, and put my hand on something warm. It was Serev. He lay half under an overturned transit carriage where the blast must have thrown him, wrapped in torn cabling and powdered stone. For a second, I thought he was dead. Then his eyes opened, both of them still absurdly alert, in a face grey with blood loss. Shrapnel had opened his abdomen exactly where I had last seen him wounded in the cathedral. Somebody, perhaps he himself, had packed the wound with cloth and cable insulation to keep the rest of him from leaving. His Vox set was gone. One hand still twitched against his chest, as if searching for controls that no longer existed. I looked toward the sweep line. 3 more minutes, perhaps less, and they would reach the carriage row. I could leave him. That is the plain truth. I could have gone then, alone, into one of the underways before the line closed. A single, half-crippled man has a better chance of slipping through rubble and dark than a half-crippled man carrying another. no one would have condemned me. There remained nobody whose judgment mattered. Helicon had become a place where choosing self over the dying was not villainy, but arithmetic. Serev saw the calculation on my face and managed a broken smile. "Go," he whispered. Instead, I dragged him free. He bit down on the sound when the carriage weight shifted off him. I got one arm under his shoulders and hauled him upright by inches, both of us shaking, both of us slick with grime and dried blood. He was lighter than he should have been. The siege had been eating him long before the shrapnel did. He tried once to help and nearly fainted from the effort. "This is stupid," he breathed. "Yes." "Good." I got him across my shoulders in something between a fireman's carry and an embrace of mutual collapse. Every step after that felt borrowed. We dropped into the service cut just as the sweep line reached the carriage row above us. Shock staves cracked. Someone shouted for a survivor to stand. Someone else screamed once, and then no more. Dust drifted down through the seam overhead as boots passed within arm's reach of where we hid. When the line moved on, we entered the dead Undercity. There are strata beneath every hive where even war grows old. Corpse vaults, maintenance crypts, ash tunnels, abandoned after previous fires or plagues. Helicon had them in abundance, and the collapse had reopened many by tearing away the cleaner architecture above. Serev and I stumbled down into those levels, guided less by root memory than by the ancient instinct of prey moving toward darkness when the open ground belongs to hunters. The corpse vaults were full, not of the honored dead. Those rituals had long since failed. These were overflow places from older centuries, decommissioned chambers packed with stacked remains, sealed ossuary bins, and the dry black dust of men forgotten before our grandfathers were born. The blast had broken some vault doors open. Bones spilled into the passages. Skulls rolled under our boots. In one chamber, a whole wall of burial niches had collapsed, and the mummified dead had poured out with their prayer tablets still wired to their wrists. We picked our way through them because there was nowhere else to tread. Far above and sometimes terribly near, the new masters of Helicon spoke. Iron warriors' voices carried through vent lines and foundation cracks in clipped bursts of command. Allocate labor, mark the next trench depth, refit that gun, survey the eastern sanctum, confirm void shielding on the captured furnace stacks. And threaded through those practical orders were discussions of what came next, spoken with the same grim patience as if one hive's death were merely a prelude already accounted for. "The northern hive bastions remain resistant," one voice said somewhere above us through a cracked drain shaft. "Their western ash berm is vulnerable to subsurface pressure. Then begin boring assessments once Helicon output is stabilized. Warsmith Drail wants gun tonnage transferred before third watch. Correct. This world is not finished. Only this city is." We moved while hearing them plan the next suffering. Serev drifted in and out of waking. Sometimes he muttered impact timings under his breath, still hearing patterns in the distance. Sometimes he asked for the Vox and then remembered, with visible shame, that there was no Vox anymore. Once he laughed weakly and said, "At least the guns sound farther away down here." "They are." "No," he whispered after a pause. "We are." Somewhere in the ash tunnels we found a cistern chamber cracked open to the outside by shell damage high above. Cold grey light bled through a shattered observation slit no wider than my forearm. I lowered Serev against the wall and climbed to it because after everything Helicon had become, I still wanted, idiotically, to see whether the world beyond the hive remained real. It did. That was the worst of it. From the slit I saw the horizon of Culdrex Tertius and learned how small Helicon's agony had always been in relation to the war consuming the planet. Other hives burned in the distance, each one a pillar of smoke and furnace glow under the poisoned sky. Some burned clean and vertical, where promethium stores had gone up. Others sagged black and red, where structural collapses spread fire through hab layers like rot. Between them, the ash plains crawled with convoy lights, artillery flashes and moving engine columns too numerous to count. High overhead, orbital wrecks came down through the cloud deck like meteors, shedding fire as they fell. One great fragment struck somewhere beyond the eastern ranges and lit the horizon white for a moment before the smoke swallowed it. Billions were still dying across Kaldrex Tertius, not metaphorically, not as some grand strategic abstraction scribbled on a chart. Actually, bodily, in real numbers beyond any clerk's endurance to tally. Helicon had not been the war. It had only been one solved problem within it. I stayed at that slit until the cold bit through the sweat and dust on my skin, and the truth had nowhere else to go inside me. An Iron Warrior's siege is horror, not because it is loud, though it is loud beyond reason. Not because it is cruel, though cruelty is its chosen instrument. Not even because it kills on such a scale that human grief becomes a logistical inconvenience. It is horror because it strips war down to function. Every wall becomes a calculation. Every prayer becomes a delay. Every living body becomes labor, food, ballast, information, or obstruction. And function, once freed of all softer lies, has no mercy in it at all. When I climbed down, Serev was awake again. "What do you see?" he asked. "The world." He studied my face for a second and decided that was answer enough. We went on, not toward victory, not toward rescue. Those were words for other men in other kinds of stories. We went because we were still able to put one foot before the other in a city full of those who no longer could. I took his weight again, and he accepted mine where my own body buckled. Together we limped deeper into the dead undercity, past ossuaries and ash drifts and forgotten machine, shrines, while above us Helicon was turned brick by brick, body by body, into an enemy fortress. I did not look back again. There was no need. The lesson of the siege had entered me too deeply for sight to add anything more. As the darkness closed around us and the sounds of labor, shelling and ordered cruelty became the pulse of the hive above, I understood at last what the Iron Warriors had done and why it would endure longer in the mind than any individual death within it. They did not break the world. They proved it was breakable.